Good morning. Excellent. It's good to see you all again. I feel like we've gone through this incredible journey together the last couple of days, and I think this last day is going to really bring home the whole purpose of this conference. I want to say that I heard a rumor that some of our panelists, as a delegation, visited some of Chicago's fine drinking establishments last night. It's just a rumor, and we're all about verification, so I'm just offering this. And I only say that to say there's lots of coffee out there, because some of them are on our panels today. You know, the credo. We're on a campus here, of a great university. We have some really distinguished academics with us. But I want to emphasize, this was never meant to be an academic conference. The credo of the Institute of Politics is inspiring thought, empowering action. We have had a lot of thought-provoking panels. Our goal is that when we leave here today, that we leave with a greater sense, not just of urgency, but of possibility, that we are inspired to take action and empowered to take action. And the last two panels today will deal with some of the official actions that can be taken to help deal with this challenge to our democracy and all democracies. The first two panels will, I think, speak to the urgency, even more so to why we have to take action. The first will deal with disinformation and political violence. The second will deal with disinformation and the threats to national security. And you know, we have just remarkable people on our rostrum today, on our program today. I will save the first panel for last, but I just want to mention that the second panel on Taming the Wild Wild Web will include Senator Amy Klobuchar, who is doing remarkable work on this subject in the Senate today. Former Governor Deval Patrick of Massachusetts, who is the co-chair of the Future of Tech Commission, and they'll be in conversation with Swisher, who needs no introduction to this group, the creator of Recode, columnist, podcaster, and most importantly, a beloved former fellow at the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. I think that's the thing that she's proudest of. I don't want to speak for her. On the Countering Disinformation's Threat to National Security panel, we'll have former Representative Will Hurd and current Representative Elissa Slotkin, each of whom came out of the intelligence community and into elective office. So they bring a unique perspective, and they will be in conversation with Bart Gellman, who may be I think the most incisive writer in the country on these questions, and you can see his work in The Atlantic. If I didn't say that, I would have to face Jeff Goldberg afterwards, and he'd be angry about that. And then we're going to finish with a panel on imagining a better social media, and that will include Frances Haugen, who everyone knows. I'm sure she's sick of being referred to as whistleblower Frances Haugen, but what she really is a Paul Revere on this very urgent challenge. As is Ethan Zuckerman from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, who's also carried this lantern for a long time. Cecilia Kang, the co-author of An Ugly Truth Inside Facebook's Battle for Domination, who covers this issue for the New York Times. And Erin Simpson, and I just need to mention this. Erin is a fellow at the IOP this quarter. She is an expert on this subject at the Center for American Progress. It's the first time that we've had a student who began at the Institute of Politics 10 years ago come back as a fellow. And when you see her on this panel, you'll understand why. And we're just really, really proud of her and as a representative of all of our students. But let me introduce the first panel, targeted by lies, how disinformation spurs political violence. It will include Kathleen Belew, a professor here at the University of Chicago, who wrote a book in 2018 that got a lot of attention called Bring the War Home Inside the White Power Movement. And, give me the word. Kathleen, are you in the room? Where are you? What word am I missing? And paramilitary America. I can't read my own handwriting is the problem. This will not surprise my staff. Of course, Chris Krebs, who we all know, former director of cybersecurity of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and finally Adam Kinzinger, who is a representative from Illinois, who also needs no introduction. He's become famous, and I think deservedly so, for the courage that he's shown on issues of democracy, and that discussion will be moderated by Bart Gellman. Actually, Jeff Goldberg, you're moderating the discussion that I ascribed to. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Verification, fact checking on the spot. So with that, let me welcome this distinguished panel.
Good crew.
So in college, I never took the 9 o'clock class. So welcome to everyone and congratulations for making it. I wanted to start with you, Congressman, if I could, and
Sure.
ask you to talk a little bit about your own experience on January 6th.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, everybody. Good to see you. And Axelrod, good to see you. As you guys maybe know, you can never say no to David Axelrod if he gets his hooks in you. So it's good to be here. It's good to be with the panel. Chris is an absolute great dude and hero. As you guys find out about what he did leading up to the election, my wife worked, by the way, at DHS, and she was always talking about how great that CISA was run. So good to be with you, man. Real quick, so yeah, January 6th, look, I predicted violence on that day. It's actually interesting. Chris and I had a conversation prior to that where I just basically said, I think there's going to be violence on January 6th. I'm looking on the internet. I'm seeing these comments, some targeted at me. And by the way, if you convince, half of the country that the election was stolen, you should expect really nothing else, because the gist of our country was built on the fact that you go vote, your vote is counted, and if in fact you're being oppressed by an oppressive government, you overthrow it. And so it's actually not a huge leap to think that there would be violence. So on January 6th, I had my staff stay home. I used to say I had my wife stay home, but now I say I asked my wife to stay home, but she did. And I actually went into work armed that day, and certainly I went out on the floor as the proceedings opened, and I decided to go back to my office and watch it. And by the time I was back there, I had heard that the outer perimeter of the Capitol had been breached. And then, over a period of the next hour or so, I ended up finding out that, of course, everybody got into the Capitol. And I think the thing to keep in mind at that point is, once the Capitol complex is breached, there is really nothing to stop the entire complex from being overrun. That includes the office buildings. And I was in my office building, and we got the order to lock in place. And so I was alone in my office, again, armed, had the doors shut and locked, and actually had to entertain the idea that I may end up having to shoot some people that come into the office because, I'd been targeted on Twitter. And anyway, you guys know how the rest of the day went, but I do want to make a quick point. At the end of the night, it was probably 3 a.m., we finally went out. You know, I gone on the floor actually when we finally took the votes, and people ask me all the time, when you went back on the floor, did you just feel like, oh, democracy is prevailing and this is great? And I'm like, yeah, eventually I got that feeling. Like, you know, it's great that democracy prevailed in the face of what happened. When I went on the floor, though, I was angry. I was furious. And I gave a speech in which I said, the emperor has no clothes. And I realized that the people behind me in my own party weren't applauding and were upset that I had said that. And I realized it was going to be a long next couple of years. And anyway, go home at 3:30 in the morning. And the thing that always sticks out to me, I'm a National Guardsman. We had spent that whole day waiting for the guard to come. And I saw actually my first guard troops as I was leaving at 3:30 in the morning, and that was an emotional moment for me as a guardsman myself. So, yeah, it was a bad day. And but democracies aren't defined by bad days; they're defined by how they come back from bad days. And that's what's going to make the next few months or years even all the more important.
What made you predict ahead of time that there would be violence?
Oh, it's the easiest thing to predict. I mean, and I think Chris will tell you too, because he was watching what was going on. But you look in I guess it was Telegram channels. You look in, even just right there on Twitter. Yeah, everything, and it was organizations that said this is 1776. We had a congresswoman that tweeted this is 1776 that morning. I don't know what else that means. But I remember seeing comments, because I was obviously very aggressive right after the election, even leading up to it. I had, one comment with a hangman's noose as a reply, and, Kinzinger, where's your office? We're coming for you. I don't know if I necessarily predicted that the Capitol would be breached and occupied, but I certainly knew there would be violence. I actually am surprised it wasn't widely predicted.
Well, I think it was. I mean, the indicators were there. For some, but maybe the outcomes were different than were expected. My story that day is I was planning to relocate because I had seen some of the indicators. After I was fired and I did 60 Minutes, an attorney for the president went on TV or a show and said something to the effect that I needed to be given the traitor's punishment,
Right.
drawn and quartered. And at that point, my death threats spiked. I mean, significant increase. And so I had armed guards in front of my house, 24/7 for 2 months. And I remember right around January 3rd that the management team from the security company said, hey, we're having some problems covering you on the 6th because all the businesses downtown in Washington, D.C. are asking for an increased security presence. So all the normal day-to-day guards that I had started shifting downtown. So they actually had to put managers out in the field. And so on January 6th, as we were at a family member's house, I had to run back home. And it was one of the most shocking, striking memories I have of the entire event, where I pull up to my house and there's a car in front of the house that I had never seen before, and it had a giant 3%er sticker on the back.
Oh, dude.
It was my security guard.
Wow.
And I was like, oh, this is interesting. And it just shows you some of the overlap in terms of the extremist groups, as well as some of the folks that have some of the security training that we're relying upon.
What can historical context tell us, Madam Historian, about January 6th and the environment we've got now? How does it compare to other periods of political violence in our history?
I've been thinking about this throughout our conference, and especially yesterday on the other panel that you spoke on, Chris, about, we've had a lot of remarks about, it seems like this has a longer scale. It seems like we might need some more long, deep context about what we're talking about, and not sort of in an intellectual references way, but there are real social movements that are pushing these things through. And I think history can tell us a lot about a central question of this conference that I think we have not adequately engaged, which is, we've said over and over some version of people want to know the truth, people want to know facts, people want to get good information, people don't want to be duped. One thing that history shows us, especially the history of some of the extremist groups that were involved in January 6th, is that for these activists, they simply have a different worldview and a different understanding of what that truth is than most of us in this room. And we don't see that only on the fringe. A lot of this is not, well, so historians might think about this less as disinformation and more as a problem of narrative construction, right? Worldview construction. It's motivated by sincerity. It's motivated by deep, earnest belief in many cases. And then it's also maliciously sort of manipulated by people who want, what did you say earlier? Power, money, and influence. Power, money, and influence for their own purposes, many of whom are interested in overthrowing the United States, not to put too fine a point on it. And those folks on January 6th were able to use a combination of those sort of narrative constructions and worldviews and manipulation to push what happened. So I study neo-Nazis, Klansmen, skinheads, and militia groups from the late 1970s through the Oklahoma City bombing. And that earlier period really has a lot to tell us about what we're seeing now because, as you were saying earlier, out of this room, and as you just were talking about like we all know what happened on January 6th, we might, but we don't have a story about January 6th, not by a long shot. And part of the reason we don't is that the archive of information that gives us a wide view, that gives us not only what groups say they're doing, but what they're in fact doing, that gives us the relationship between people and actors, the sequence of events over time that begins to round out these questions about belief and sincerity, will not be available for this for, I would argue, at least 20 years. When we get people leaving the movement and testifying against compatriots and big court record declassifications and all kinds of things. And this might be different for you on the committee with your subpoena powers and your sort of access to classified documents that most of us don't have. But I still think wide view is very difficult to do in real time. When we have a historical cognate, there's a whole bunch that we can learn through comparative study, especially because this is the same movement that has been with us unbroken since the late 1970s. Same people, same organizing strategies, same worldview, same set of conspiracy theories, although we changed the language around the edges. So we know a lot about how belief works. We know a lot about what's a likely target. And there's a scene in the Turner Diaries, which is we can talk more about this if people would like to, but is a dystopian white power novel that came out in the late 1970s that describes an attack on the Capitol vividly similar to what we saw on January 6th. So this has been imagined over and over and over again, right? So we can triangulate the sort of intel gathering side, the sort of Twitter activity, the what are people doing that we see through surveillance agencies and police work and that set of tools. We can triangulate that with understanding the historical context and have a much, much more full picture of what's motivating and what's pushing. And I think that that is a critical piece of context for understanding and confronting the problem.
You made a distinction between disinformation and worldview construction. That sounded important. Say a little more about that.
So I guess, I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm a word-defining person and because historians, disinformation is an uncomfortable word for me for a number of reasons. And part of it has to do with the definition that President Obama offered us on the first day about sort of this will to mislead. If you look at the way that, say, the white power movement leadership was disseminating ideas in the 1980s, they were trafficking in a set of things that we would understand as conspiracy theory, then called the Zionist occupational government, later called the New World Order. It has appeared under the name the Deep State recently, and then, accelerationism is basically the same thing under different sort
Chris
of
was a member
wide
of the
trappings.
Deep State, so he can tell you all about it.
Yeah, there you go. So, but the idea is that there is a cabal of elites that are in charge of a purposeful campaign to destroy the white race through a set of social issues that some of us might think of as capital C conservative, like opposing abortion, opposing immigration, opposing LGBT rights, opposing feminism, opposing women in the workplace, opposing residential integration. But for activists in this movement, that was all about this perceived threat to the reproduction of the white race. The people that were acting earnestly to deal with what they saw as an assault on their race sometimes were manipulative and trying to use these ideas for particular purposes, but many times were acting sincerely and believed they had the truth and talked about awakening, right? That's not the same thing as, well, I mean, it gets back to what Maria Ressa was saying on day one about this is not something you can solve with facts, right? Because there's no fact you can tell to this particular worldview that wouldn't just affirm the entire project.
What are you seeing on the January 6th committee, Congressman, that that resonates with what Kathleen is talking about, the idea that white power is a significant factor in what happened on January 6th?
Well, I can't get into a lot of what we're seeing. There's a lot, obviously, that's out there in the media front. We'll be having hearings over the summer and ultimately a report. But that is one of the areas we're certainly looking at is we have basically 5 pillars of this investigation, everything from the Capitol posture to the president's actions, all that kind of stuff. But when it comes to the 3 percenters, First Amendment Praetorian, I always forget that word, Oath Keepers, all these kind of groups, that's a significant part of our investigation. Was it coordinated? What was done online? Is this something that just kind of popped up? Was it planned? Was it organized? Was it armed? What was the intention? I mean, some of the stuff that's out there publicly is, the Oath Keepers and some of those groups were under the belief that President Trump was going to declare the Insurrection Act and then basically take away the military and domestic law enforcement's authority, and under the Insurrection Act, he was going to actually put the 3 percenters and the Oath Keepers in charge of security of the Capitol. One of the things you were saying that I think is really important is you have to look at this, whether it's in counterterrorism, whether it's in any kind of, straight up warfare like we see in Russia, Ukraine. Everybody thinks they're the good guy. Everybody thinks they're the good guy. Al-Qaeda thinks they're the good guys. And so you have to look at it when you fight an enemy from the perspective of what is it that motivates them. And as was mentioned in their perspective, the fear is that this country is going to leave them behind. There are people that truly believe that those of us in government are into adrenochrome. Adrenochrome is when you bleed out babies and inject their blood so that you can be younger. They really believe this. They believe that we are Satan-worshiping pedophiles everywhere in government. And so while that is insane, we have to look at that and say they truly believe it. And so looking at these radical groups is an extremely important part of that in terms of what is their motivation. We have a lot of information. Obviously, DOJ's moved on some of this as well, and obviously look forward to putting that out in front of the American people. Because I think when it comes to the January 6th committee, it is essential to show you guys what we have, obviously, to play that story out. But I think our real audience is history. Because in 5 or 10 years, when my kid is in school and he's learning about January 6th, I want him to know the truth. I don't want there to be any shred of doubt that the FBI and Ray Epps somehow organized January 6th and an insurrection, or it was the deep state, or it was anything but what it was, which was a Trump-inspired insurrection. And that's what the important audience is in 5 or 10 years on this. And that's, you talk about that perspective of history, right? And there were probably a lot more Richard Nixon supporters when Nixon resigned than there are today that, were actually Nixon supporters then. Everybody kind of denies it, right? I think the same thing will happen with Donald Trump, by the way. Everybody that's pretty super into Trump now in 10 years will tell their kids they never voted for the guy. But that's the goal here, is history actually is a lot faster than we think.
So may I just respond? There's one sort of attendant issue that we have to think about, which is the fact that Proud Boys and other groups that were involved on January 6th have made local school boards the front lines of this effort. Yeah. If we would like our kids to be able to learn history and to learn about the January 6th report, or to learn an account of the Civil War, to learn about why we needed an anti-lynching bill that we signed last week. I mean, those classroom spaces have to remain in focus as part of this set of information problems. And we've seen that, I'm from Colorado, we've seen sort of like school board targeting and attempts to degrade the study of history as a concerted strategy for a while, but the fever pitch that we're reaching around silencing history is, as a historian, especially concerning, but it should be concerning to everybody. I mean, this is, That's not a, well, anyhow, it's just something we should put on the list of, we keep talking about magic wands and wish lists of things we wish we could fix, and that's.
But then you have to get into the why.
Yeah.
Sorry, Bart, sidetrack here, but you have to get into the why, and I think from a historical perspective, the last 5 years probably, what happened? There was a significant shift in the permission structures that have now, what was 4 or 5 years ago was such a fringe edge movement, now has become almost mainstream. And a lot of the questions post January 6th, at least I was getting, is like, when should we expect the next attack on the Capitol? It's like, you missed the point. This established a high tide, and even if the tide recedes and it's happening at the state and local level, it's still massively problematic. And that is what I think we've seen, not necessarily political violence in the form of storming state capitals, but the way it's kind of infiltrated the political discourse. And we were not serious either in DC or in state capitals.
And the sanctity, by the way, of the U.S. Capitol was violated and will forever be that way. I know it's weird to say it that way, but it used to be kind of this almost religious experience to go to the U.S. Capitol, even when I worked there. And after that happened, then of course, after Minnie and my party start denying whatever happened or cheapen it or say that it was a tourist, visit, it doesn't have the same feeling, and that's a frightening thing a little bit. It's part of that high water mark.
I think we have consensus here on the stage that January 6th was not an isolated incident, that it's part of a trend or a pattern. But I wonder if maybe starting with you, Chris, we could talk about where you see that going. Is it on the upswing? Are we in for more in the next election cycles?
Well, I think, as I said, the permission structure has shifted, and that's allowing a more permissive environment for political violence, for political speech that is not of the traditional, constructive manner. It's more of the 30-second sound bites on TV. Everybody's angling to get that little snippet that gets replayed on Twitter and Gab and Parler and Truth and all that other stuff. So where do I think it's going? I think to Kathleen's earlier point about how it's gotten down into the local school board level, the 22 election, and this was talked about a little bit yesterday. I think Mary McCord talked about this, and we talked about it on our panel yesterday as well. The 22 election is so important, but more, as I see it, at the statewide election level than for the House of Representatives. And specifically, I'm talking about Secretary of State races in Arizona, Colorado, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. You have candidates from the Republican side that are active Stop the Stealers. Many of them have said they would not have certified the 2020 election. And once you get into that, if someone like that were to win in 22 and is in a position to be a certifying official of the 24 election, then you're kind of throwing the wheel out the window.
Yep.
And there's a significant amount of political risk involved here. And again, through whether it's disinformation or just broader alternative narrative constructions of fraud in the mail-in ballots or whatever you want to call it, that has a significant amount. That's where I'm concerned. You will lose confidence in the electoral process, and as David Axelrod was saying, the electoral process is the very fabric of America, and that is at risk of unraveling.
And I want to add to that. So democracy, the basic thing you need for democracy, by the way, democracy is the most difficult form of government. Having an authoritarian ruler is really easy, actually. You don't even have to work at it, right? You just live your life. They take care of all the hard stuff. Democracy is really difficult. The one thing we have to have for democracy to function, you and I, if you're on the far left and I'm on the right, and kind of center right, I guess, not far right, but we could agree on nothing. But the one thing we have to agree on, is that our vote will count and that the results will be accurate, and that's it, right? And then we use Washington, D.C., we argue words, we let the steam out of the violence, and we come to solutions. And the problem, as Chris was mentioning with a Secretary of State, for instance, if Heiss wins in Georgia. If you have Georgia with the same thing, he refuses to certify the election. We've let the Constitution, and some of these actually unanswered questions of the Constitution, dictate how we count votes and how we go to a new government. If somebody is a wrench in that wheel, you have a constitutional crisis. I'll just end it with something like this. There is one unsung hero on January 6th. I mean, there's a lot of unsung heroes on January 6th, but one in particular is a clerk in the Senate that, as the Senate was evacuating, she remembered to grab the box of ballots that the state sent. Had the rioters gotten in, burned the ballots, stolen the ballots, otherwise destroyed them, the Electoral Count Act reads that you can't just say, well, I read in the paper that Georgia went for Biden. You have to have the actual certified ballot. So they would have had to go back to the states to send a certification ballot again, and you already know what they were talking about then. It wouldn't have happened, and we would have been thrown into a massive constitutional crisis. Certainly the Supreme Court would have stepped in and stopped it, but you can see how you continue down that road, and you ended up in a place where it is simply turning to violence is the only way to solve your problems, and that's scary.
Well, Congressman, take Chris's scenario of a election-denying Secretary of State in some critical state who refuses to certify the vote because the Democrat has won the next election. What happens then?
The Electoral Count Act doesn't, it's not clear. And that's why, sorry, I'm not the congressman,
please go.
But that is part of why there was a push over the last 6 months for clarification. Ben Ginsberg, a Republican political lawyer, really pushed for this as well, but we need clarification of who is the certifying authority in each state. Who should the Congress recognize on January 6th?
Yeah, that's where we need to have, one of the things I've been pushing for is Electoral Count Act reform. It's not as easy as it sounds. And I also need to be very clear, this is not a panacea. It's not a silver bullet for the long term. This is a near-term thing to basically prevent something from happening in 24 because, the playbook has been run in 2020. They know how to maneuver now. And I'm not necessarily saying there's some grand conspiracy for 2024, but if we end up in the same position, but yeah, I think some of those things, absolutely, the Electoral Count Act have to be defined and reformed. If you have somebody that simply refuses, there's got to be a role for it to be adjudicated in federal courts, right? Maybe federal courts come in within about a 2-week period and have to say yay or nay to any state that certifies. There's ways to do it, but that's essential.
Well, the Supreme Court, with its increasing interest in the independent state legislature doctrine, might not go for the federal courts having a role in that.
Well, it would be in the law. It would be a law thing and not the courts. So the Electoral Count Act would basically, it's one of the things I've heard floated is basically in law it says that federal courts have to review certification. We'll see. We don't have, there's no bill yet. I'm just throwing these out there as ideas.
So I want to toss in something that's been on my mind. I've never much liked the term conspiracy theory because I think it dignifies fabrications with the idea of some scientific relevance. Theory is a science word. At a certain point, it starts off with someone just making stuff up, right? Why don't we start with a historical perspective here? Where do these things start?
So, you mean like particular conspiratorial worldviews?
Yeah.
Particular manipulations of our factual landscape? We should get, so I'm a historian of the 20th century, and my answer to you is I don't go back far enough to tell you adequately, right? So I can look at Zionist occupational government comes from Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which in the United States gets popular via Henry Ford and others in the 1920s, right? But before that, Protocols of the Elders of Zion is penned by people who are, my colleague Faith Hillis works on this, who are Russian immigrants to Paris who have their own sort of agenda that comes out of anti-Semitism in both of those countries that goes back for a much longer time, and old ideas about blood libel against Jewish populations, right? So I actually think that might not be the right question. I think the question should be, what do they do and what do they impact and why do they keep going, right? Like, what is it about that theory that grabs people? I was talking to Abby about this last night, about the Antarctica theory. Where did she go? I don't know. Hi, I'm fascinated. Like, what are they getting out of the idea of Antarctica? You know what I mean? Or like, why did they, in my research, I'm writing about Denver in my next book, so I ran into some of the Denver International Airport conspiracies, which Denver International Airport has just leaned into, and they're like, is this construction or lizard people, right? So, and please don't, if you're gonna put a clip of me on Twitter, please don't truncate that. But I mean, like, the point is that that story does something for people, and the ones that are widely successful do something for a lot of people, and the why is often a question we can get at by looking at other kinds of histories. What else is going on with American culture? What else is going on with our social makeup? What else is going on with the way that people's needs are and aren't being met in different facets of life? And usually people who turn to conspiratorial movements like the white power movement are echoing bigger shifts in American society. So white power groups that I study are interested in things like the apocalypse and the end times and nuclear warfare and a whole bunch of other fears that most everybody had in the late 20th century, right? So it's one manifestation of these bigger currents. And I think that one place that I find an antidote to a lot of these issues is the idea that that bigger current might be where we can create communities of trust and conversation. This idea that the nation is changing, right? So a lot of people are thinking about demographic change. It's just that the groups that I write about think about that as a war on the white population, whereas others are interested in, like, why do less people in my town speak English? Where did the jobs go that I believe I was entitled to because of the way that we talked about the mid-century moment of exception, the intense prosperity after World War II that we will very likely not return to. And that set of conversations could be bigger and could be more overt and could be around including instead of excluding. But to me, this all goes back to the classroom again, because the other thing that we don't teach anymore is civics. People don't know how elections work, right? So if you have a whole bunch of people storming the Capitol to protest how they think the election is rigged, who don't know how elections work, we have like the pre-bunking problem again, and we have an education problem, and we need a different tool set for these than a barrage of facts.
But election officials are not optimized for that sort of engagement.
Oh, no. This is high school classroom, I think.
So, right. I mean, when you make the point about people don't understand how elections work, they think they show up the morning, if they're not in a mail-in vote, if they're not voting by mail, they vote that morning or whatever, then they turn on Fox or CNN or whatever, and they see the outcome. And that's it, never minding the fact that there's months of preparation, including primaries, and then after the fact, there's canvassing, there's auditing, there's certification, then it goes up. I mean, it's a system of systems. We have to do a better job of educating and getting out of kind of the black box model. But I think, Bart, to your more specific point on 2020, where did those theories come from and how do we apply those going forward? If you look at the 2020 election, the stage was set probably in 2016 by the former president, but it really took off in the summer of 2020 with some of the COVID adjustments that election officials put in place and the shift to mail-in ballots. So in 2016, about 80% of voters had a paper ballot associated with their vote, and there were systems that you touch the screen and it gets recorded down on, the vote gets recorded down on removable media. We really worked aggressively over the 4 years between 16 and 20 to get Congress to allocate money and to get states like Georgia and Pennsylvania to get those systems out so that a vote cast would have a voter verifiable paper audit trail associated with it. And in part due to the shift to mail-in voting due to COVID, we went from about 80% across the country to 95%. Significant resilience measure, and that's how we were looking at it. Now the challenge is that shift to mail-in voting got picked up in the summer by the president, the former attorney general, and others as this is the highway to massive fraud. And so that set the expectation. And Kate Starbird, who's a researcher, disinformation researcher at University of Washington, and others, I think Joan Donovan's here as well, and they talk about this concept of participatory disinformation. And that starts trickling down, it hits the audience, and the audience is then primed and on the lookout for this kind of this mail-in. And then they see things that don't make sense, and they're like, aha, there it is. And then it swoops up to the influencers. And that, like, there was the Disinfo Dirty Dozen for COVID, same thing went there were super spreaders and influencers that would then push it out. It would get picked up in media. But what happened along the way, and this is where there was a bit of A/B testing in 2020, is you have this domestic fraud narrative that's building, and then late October comes along, and then people realize that there's opportunity for influence and money. The crazies come on board, and then boom, dead Venezuelan dictators, the Kraken, Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani, all about these narratives of foreign external, the Chinese, the Russians, the Venezuelans, the space aliens, all this other stuff that were manipulating ballots, and the foreign interference narrative spiked. The problem was they used both these fantastical concepts of Italian satellites beaming in. They used, again, the Venezuelan, the Hugo Chavez narrative, and it didn't resonate, and it was hard to describe. So it was both fantastical and technically complex and incoherent. And so from an A/B perspective, the foreign stuff didn't work. And even now, when you hear the narratives that are sticking on 2020, it's still about domestic fraud. It's still about the ballot mules and the harvesters. So I would expect going forward in 24 that you're going to see more domestic narratives than the foreign narratives, because they've proven that the foreign narratives are really hard to hit mainstream, assuming you're trying to convince anyone of anything, which is not necessarily always the case in disinfo more broadly. Sometimes the point is just to flood the zone and lose perspective and truth.
I think that tells the story of Stop the Steal and Dominion voting machines and that kind of set of narratives, right? But I think the other part that we have to keep in view is the smaller group of extremist activists like Oath Keepers, Praetorians, Proud Boys, and the folks that were on the 6th, the most highly organized, the most militarized, the people with advanced plans, the people who are connected with one another. And this was clear from the footage from the jump, and the subpoena information seems to be confirming this now, unless you know something I don't know. But those folks are trafficking in conspiracy worldviews that go back way farther. And they've been hanging out just waiting for an opportunity. So the way I teach this to my undergraduates is that the Klan and the white power movement and sort of the different manifestations of this, they come and go through American history. They change forms quite a bit, but they're always opportunistic. They're always interested in kind of parachuting into the local context, tacking on to whatever local tension is available and whatever cultural forms are possible and popular, right? Which is why we see the tropical print shirt coming into view at a particular moment. Or, you can go back to the 20s and look at the very fashionable ladies' Klan robes. It's the same thing in a different moment. That's about just figuring out a window of opportunity for the thing they want to do anyway, which is recruitment, radicalization, and attack on the United States. Because white nationalism, the word we always use, we often forget that the nation in white nationalism is not the United States, it's the Aryan nation. They're interested in overthrow of the United States and fundamental reorganization of an all-white ethno-state. And I'm just saying that so we're all clear. I mean, so this is not all of January 6th protesters by any stretch, and it would be a big mistake to paint everybody with the same brush.
Yes.
But we have to pay attention to that subgroup. And the reason is that that subgroup is, first of all, I don't think at all conclusively oriented towards only pursuing electoral mechanisms of any kind, although certainly they're doing that. There is also a huge ongoing threat of mass violence and ongoing attacks on vulnerable communities, including communities of color, women, LGBT communities, trans communities, it goes on and on. So we have to keep in mind the fatalities alongside our concern for preserving democracy. I think these are twin parts of the same problem.
But I'll just say real quick on that, a part of the reason disinformation can work so well is everybody has to fight for something. That includes all of us up here. That includes all of you out there. You always want a cause you fight for. You want to be kind of the hero of the story. You want to fight injustice. And that's why I think conspiracy theories can spread so fast, is because if the CIA was attacked by DOD in Germany, that was one, by the way, if there is really this deep, dark government conspiracy going on and you have the information, you have the truth, it triggers that fight for justice button.
Tribalism.
Yep. And that is something that we could do a whole hour on tribalism too, but I think too that is just something that I don't have the answer to, but as we think about how to disinfect disinformation is like in civics education, how can you convince people that actually going to vote is fighting for something big, or, getting back to that.
You spoke earlier of disinformation as something that the consequence of it is violence. That if you believe it's 1776, if you believe that an evil cabal has stolen an election, then violence is actually the logical response. But I wonder about the relationship between disinformation and violence, whether you think violence is actually the purpose of the disinformation, that the disinformation is constructed in order to justify violence.
Possibly. Chris may be better to answer this than me. And in my view, I kind of see sometimes disinformation as not even an organized thing. It's different actors in many cases in 2020 that either created a narrative or kind of went off another narrative. It became viral. It kind of grew. And I'm not sure if violence was the end goal. I think the outcome of we're going to stay in power, or we're going to, create, in essence, an army of people that now buy into their tribe. They recognize that I can't go out now and deal with these other people, so I just have to be a member of this tribe. And that's actually something that's really frightening to me is, in the long run, we don't have the ability to disagree with each other anymore, much left, right and left don't have, sane arguments about disagreements anymore. But now within the movement of the right, which I'm familiar with, if you are for some version of gun control and you're a member of an anti-gun control group, you're going to be kicked out of that group. So everybody becomes monolithic thinkers. So I don't know if violence is the end state. Maybe it is.
It depends on your objective, I think. Again, to the power, influence, money. 3 objectives of information disorder and campaigns in general. If your objective is power, then yes, one way to do it is you identify the issue, you activate the accounts, you get things moving, you start amplifying, you hit it mainstream. And so I think January 2020, from a political disinformation power construct, was entirely predictable. Yeah. Again, you saw the stage being set in 2016, but 2020 for practical purposes, and it all built up. I mean, I just think you talked about radicalization earlier. The radicalization had been happening. The activation happened in December of 2019. The "it will be wild" tweet, that's an activation. Yeah. Proud Boys, stand back, stand by. Yeah. That was an activation. And giving them, within that shifted permission structure construct, the outlet and the encouragement, and then pointing, it was all there. Now, if you're just talking about money, no, not necessarily. If your outcome is money, COVID, some of the COVID fraudsters that were, shopping around alternative therapies, no, they just want the grip, they want the money. And even now, I think some of your colleagues are not in it for violence or money; they're in it for influence.
They don't believe any of the stuff.
They want that. They want the Twitter exposure. They want to get kicked off Twitter. Because that's a good opportunity to continue building the brand.
Instant fame. Yeah. You can get instant fame now in politics.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. So think of your questions now. Robert Pape, who's here at the University of Chicago, has done some very interesting polling, and he finds that there are about 6% of Americans who believe both that Joe Biden is an illegitimate president who was not elected to the office, and that violence is justified to restore Trump to power. It's a small percentage, but a large number of people. It correlates to about 20 million Americans. And his view is that this is just a massive dry kindling waiting for the next spark. So I'd ask any of you who want to say if you agree with that and what you think the next spark might be. What would be the precipitating event?
So the only kind of qualifier I'll put on this is that I think every president going back for decades has been, by some small subset, considered illegitimate. Trump was considered illegitimate because of the Russian interference. Obama was considered illegitimate because he was not, he was born in Kenya, or whatever the theory was. So that's always been there. The difference now, to your point, is again, I'll say it, broken record, the permission structures have shifted, and now political violence, in part because 2016 or January 6th And people have not necessarily been fully punished yet. It looks like a trial run. It looks like it was a mulligan. It was a free shot, a practice run. Do it again.
All right, let's take it to the floor. Adrian.
I can just be loud. Congressman, sorry. You're right here. Thank you. Thank you so much for doing this. Congressman, question for you. I know you talked about the January 6th committee's work being done with history in mind, but I'm also wondering, especially given the sense of sort of this clock ticking toward the next election and this dry kindling that you mentioned, have you considered making more of the committee's work public along the way? And if not, why not?
Yeah, I mean, look, a lot of it's getting out, right? You guys see this all the time. We have a lot of leaks on the committee, but I think basically it's all going to be public in the summer. And you know, there's an art between, if you constantly have new information that comes out every day or every week, people tune it out, and it becomes like the frog boiling in the water, right? You don't even notice the changes. I mean, just yesterday or 2 days ago, you know, Donald Trump said something crazy. I don't even remember what it was. A couple months ago, he admitted to basically doing a coup and asking, you know, Mike Pence to not certify the election. And it's like, wow, this should be huge news. But people are like, yeah, it's Donald Trump. So, but you will see all the information that we have this summer. And that'll be, again, through a series of hearings, which may be over a week or 2 weeks, and then ultimately in the report.
It's hard for me to see here. There's someone here in the center.
Hi, my name's Sophie Hare. I'm an undergraduate here in the college. I have a question just about educating the public about how to read through misinformation and disinformation. It's very easy to be duped online. I certainly fell for a lot of the narratives on Twitter about Ukraine very early on. Speaking to your point, Professor Belew, about the necessity of a high school civics education, is there any other education that you think is necessary?
There's so much education that's necessary. Look, I'm a historian, and I know that when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But I really think that if you think about Make America Great Again, that is a historical argument. That is asking us to think about when that is referring to, whether it was great, can we go back again, who's we, what's America? That is an argument. I think we need to engage it as a historical argument. So I think that history can offer us a ton of tools for thinking through these problems. One of them is that history has a ton of contingency in it. Things didn't have to turn out the way that they did. Like, yes, we can predict, we can go back and look, but there's all kinds of moments where history offers us a set of things that didn't happen, that could have happened, that might happen in the future. And so I think historical education at every level, but especially I think upper middle school and high school level, is critical for kind of expanding the menu of possibilities in action that might happen in the future. I think it's incredibly important.
The mic on here? Yeah.
I don't know if this, there it's working. Hi, my name's Spencer. I'm a second year at the policy school. I had a question that was touched on earlier about narratives of apocalypse and things like that, and thinking about the title of this talk, How Disinformation Spurs Political Violence. I almost wonder if the title should be How Existentialism Spurs Political Violence. When you see existentialism on both sides of the spectrum, climate change on the left and some of the things you talked about on the right. Is it possible to avoid political violence in an age where both sides think kind of it's the end of days, end of the world? Thank you.
I'll just say it real quick. I personally think it is possible. I'm actually optimistic long on America on this question because in my mind, if you look back to a really bad time, about 100 years ago in American history, pre-World War II, there was bad leadership in the country, obviously bad economy, et cetera. And out of that, social movements arose. And within 1 year, I think you had the Kiwanis, Future Farmers of America, Alcoholics Anonymous, these kind of groups that came up screaming because there was no leadership and they provided the leadership. I foresee that in the future in this country. And I think if Washington, D.C. continues to be performance-based and not serious, I think the American people will demand different and demand better. And so I don't think violence is inevitable. I think the American people will, and this isn't just me being all, politician, the American people stuff. I truly believe that they will demand better of it, and they will throw out the politicians, or they'll provide the leadership necessary. There may be more violence. I don't think it's inevitable, though.
One other thing that it gets overlooked, I think, is the contributing factor of COVID to the acceleration of disinformation and extremism over the last several years, where people got pulled out of their community and had to sit at home or whatever it was. Like going to a kid's soccer game and saying, hey, did you hear that JFK Jr. is going to be Trump's running mate in 2024? Normally, in the pre-COVID days, I would be like, you're absolutely insane. But you go on to a Facebook group or whatever, and you say that you're in a community of interest, and that those echo chambers build up. So I think as we reemerge from COVID, God willing, that you will see some of that acceleration and radicalization ebb. To your point, I hope.
I do too.
I think that might be true. Can I add something about the apocalypse? Because this is kind of, are any of my apocalypse students here? We did a class last year on the way that people have imagined the apocalypse over American history. Because this is not new to us. I mean, we have arguably a series of more pressing apocalyptic threats right now that maybe not arguably. I'm taking back the arguably. Anyway, pressing apocalyptic threats wherever you're sitting on the political spectrum. But the interesting thing about apocalypse stories is that they're actually about survival. They're about adaptation and how people adapt after the end, how people come together and form new communities of disaster, how people reach out to each other across those divides. So I think actually there's something very hopeful in that frame, should we decide to locate it.
Sunny side of apocalypse. Got the mic over here.
Hey, good morning. I'm Ali Noorani, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the rise of Christian nationalism in the context of January 6th, but not only to kind of obviously the negative side of that, but also what's the role of churches in terms of mitigating the rise of nationalism? Because you've talked about schools, but obviously churches play such a big role in all this.
I want to answer this as a Christian myself. It's very concerning. There are a number of churches that have basically become, from a house of worship of Christ and of God to a house of worship of Donald Trump. And if I look in the what I believe in the New Testament and the words of Jesus, it was all about not being involved in government. There's nothing wrong with being involved in government, but not living your life obsessed with it. It's about humans. And I think the church played a huge role in how we got to where we are. I say the church generically, and I think the church will have to play a huge leadership role in getting us out of this moment. We need pastors, we need priests, we need leaders who are going to stand up in front of the pulpit and say, we welcome Democrats in this audience as well, and we're not going to sit here and worship Donald Trump because he's a very flawed man. In fact, all men are flawed. Instead, we're going to talk about what matters, which is human souls, and government, you go do your own thing when it comes to government.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have.
There you go.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to the panel.
Thanks, guys. All right.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next panel, Taming the Wild Wild Web, with former governor of Massachusetts and co-chair of the Future of Tech Commission, Deval Patrick, Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, and moderated by Kara Swisher of the New York Times.
Have a seat. Hi, everybody. We're so excited to talk about this. I do have an announcement. Elon Musk bought the entire internet, so we don't have to worry about any of this. And I can promise it's not going to be that bad. And we will all have an edit button. Anyway, let's get started. Just this morning, we're going to talk about, it's interesting, this is a panel called Taming the Wild Wild West, Wild Wild Web. You and I have been talking about this a lot, Senator Klobuchar, and in fact, at Christmas, she sent me a card saying, "This is the year, Kara." I don't believe she put this on my Christmas card. "We're going to pass this legislation." And I was like, "No, you're not." But thank you for the Christmas promise.
Thank you for the enthusiasm.
Yes, nice. I know. I give her a hard time all the time because I've been waiting, having covered the internet for so long, for some legislation, any regulation. And I'm not a particular proponent of regulation, but no regulation on our most important and valuable industry is problematic in this country. So today you got is it today or yesterday you got a support by the Washington Post of your bill it's the first bill that's gotten out of committee since the dawn of the internet age. I think that's what you said to me. So explain what's happening right now.
Sure. Well, first I want to thank you. I want to thank Deval, who's an incredible leader. And it's so great to be back at University of Chicago, where I went to law school. Yay! And had a lot of fun, even though some people didn't think it was a fun place to go. I had a great time. And seeing so many friends, Frances Haugen, hero over there. I'm very pleased to be back. You should also know that I could be with our newest Supreme Court Justice today, celebrating at the White House. We're so excited for her. But as I told the White House, I've already moved on to my next challenge, which is this. And the reason that we are seeing a change and that we are finally seeing momentum on tech competition legislation and privacy legislation and legislation to protect kids is simply because this era of just trust us from the big tech companies has come to an end. And there's a lot of reasons that has happened. Some is Frances shedding the light on these privacy violations and what's happening to kids and the content that they are exposed to. Some of it is action that we're seeing in other countries where Australia stood up and said we want journalists to be able to be paid for their content, or the European Union is standing up to say that we no longer want to see these gatekeepers discriminating against their competitors, or what we're seeing in our own country right now. And so what our legislation does, and believe me, I had a much broader concept because I think in general there's too much consolidation in our country. Our country was founded on this simple idea that we like entrepreneurship and capitalism, that we like freedom of expression. And when you see more and more consolidation, that makes it harder to get that kind of competition that we've always embraced in this country as how we move forward. But what we've done here is taken one piece of this, which I think is a good start and really one of the big basic problems. And that is that when you have gatekeepers, like say a Google, with 90% market share, I kid you not, okay, that's where we are right now, and the Justice Department can deal with whether or not that's fair or not. But if you have that situation, you shouldn't also be allowing companies that are dominant gatekeepers to put their products, self-preference their products that they also own. We're not saying get rid of Google Maps. We're not saying get rid of any of your Amazon basics. We're just saying you cannot put these over other competitive products when you advertise or how they're placed on the platform. Secondly, you can't rip off people's data that you have access to. That is just a ridiculous situation uncovered by reporting by many outlets, including the Wall Street Journal. And my favorite one was a 4-employee company in Brooklyn, a luggage organizer company, where they had actually put their plans out there, and Amazon got it, and they copied it and put it on Amazon Basic. Not really a fair and equal playing field there. So you can't do that. And the third part of this is that you can't require companies to buy a whole bunch of stuff and having to buy all of these services just to get placed near the top of the platforms. That's a simple way to describe it, but it's about self-preferencing. Grassley and I have the bill. He's the master tweeter, of course. Never tweets without a typo.
That's how you know it's him.
Yeah, that's how you know. And the use of the word you, which he also sends text to me all the time. God bless you. So anyway, he and I are leading the bill, and we have what Samantha Bee called the Ocean's 11 of co-sponsors. We have everyone from Lindsey Graham and Dick Durbin, yay, Illinois, doing an incredible job, by the way, to Cory Booker and Mazie Hirono, to Josh Hawley, Cynthia Lummis, Steve Daines, Senator Blumenthal, the list goes on.
All right, so you have this bill, and it's gotten out of committee, which
16 to 6, not that I'm counting.
Which is an astonishing thing that it's taken, I don't know, 25 years since the internet started to get any legislation just out of committee. I wonder, now it's got to have a House. There are still ways to not pass it, correct?
Yeah, but the House has been, and I should have, it's Cicilline and Ken Buck, bipartisan pair, led this 18 months of investigation into the gatekeepers and did an incredible job. And they have passed their own bills. One of them is similar to this, and we're working as a team. When you're up against 2,700 tech lobbyists, I promise that's how many there are, who spent $70 million against your bill last year, you really can't afford to have jealousies or divides between the houses. So we've been working on this and strategizing together the entire time.
So what do you think the chances of it passing are? What is the biggest obstacle? Because we do have this midterm election coming in November. If the House changes power, Kevin McCarthy, who's from California, supported by the tech industry, what happens then?
So the biggest obstacle is the 2,700 lobbyists and the $70 million spent against it. I have 2 lawyers, I'm not kidding, against 2,700 lobbyists. Cicilline and Buck each have 1, Grassley has 1 or 2. That's our team. They're really smart lawyers. They might not have gone to University of Chicago, but they're smart anyway. So, there's that. But we have the Justice Department now has endorsed the bill. So that means the entire legal team, which is big, at the Justice Department can give advice to senators and the like. And we've obviously worked on this now for years. So I say we have the wherewithal to do this and to make the changes that will still keep the bill strong. But I think getting our colleagues to realize you just can't keep hearing from your constituents about all these problems and do nothing. It's so easy to do nothing when things are complicated. In Washington, we like to do things that are sudden, that are problems like hurricanes or, floods or financial crises. We're right on it. If it's things that are really stupid but immediate, we also like those, right? Like, oh, this was a mean tweet. How are we going to reply? But when it is long-term, complex, hard things, that is the hardest thing to accomplish, and this is that.
So if you don't pass it by the midterm elections, I'm guessing it don't get passed, correct?
Oh, I wouldn't bet on that, but I think we are going to pass it by the midterm elections. Because both Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader Schumer has given their support, and they've also promised us floor time for it. There are many Republicans that are supporting this. The key is to keep it on the focus, because of course people have different things they want to do with the bill. And at the same time, as I look over there at Francis, simultaneously working on federal privacy legislation, which Deval knows a lot about, and also on kids' privacy legislation. So I'm feeling more momentum than I have for years. I'm able to say I met with Margaret Vestager yesterday from the European Union. They're proceeding on their uniquely European way to do this, which is a more of a regulatory scheme. And then if you violate it, that's it.
And they have passed, they're passing this Digital Markets Act.
Right, and I'm able to say our bill is a more moderate version of that. It's uniquely American, as we always are. It sets the standards, and if Justice or FTC or State Attorney General want to come in and say you violated it, they can. So it's a different approach, and I think it's appealing to my colleagues to know we're not doing the exact same thing as Europe.
That Europe is doing. But nonetheless, that is moving through, and Europe is essentially, there's 2 regulators of tech. Deval, I want you to talk about this right now. Europe, Margaret Vestager, and Tim Cook. are the two regulators of tech right now. And Tim is more effective at this point because those bills haven't gotten into place. Okay.
I mean, I'll just say it is moving. They have an agreement in Europe.
Yes, they got
all
that.
their countries. They have.
Yes.
It is coming up for a vote in the next few months. I mean, it is happening in Europe.
It is happening in Europe.
And it'll take effect in 2024.
And
And they already have a privacy.
And it will be the de facto.
And the world hasn't fallen apart. I will.
Right. So this idea that I'm going to move to Tim Cook. Tim Cook passed this privacy, these opt-in consent things, and affected Facebook rather severely. For now, they'll figure a way around it because they're sneaky people. But talk a little bit. You're leading a commission called the Future of Tech.
Yes.
No insult to you, but I have been to so many commissions on the future of tech. And very little happens, it seems like that. So talk a little bit about like broadband was one of your issues. I think I was in a broadband meeting with Newt Gingrich 20 years ago talking about these.
I might have been in
I
that same
traveled the
meeting.
country with Newt Gingrich.
Yeah.
He used to be funny.
Yeah.
And Steve Case talking about these issues. So talk a little bit what you're doing and where's I'm sorry to be so irritated, but after a while, I'm not really sorry to be irritated.
I know.
But talk about what you're trying to do with the Biden administration, with Tom Steyer and then
I want to start also, Kara, with notwithstanding the snark in the question.
Thank you.
Thanking you for convening us. Thanks to the organizers and David Axelrod for inviting me, and thank you, Senator, for your incredible leadership. It's always been a source of inspiration for me, as I think you know. So this commission is something that we were talking about with folks who are now in the White House back in the summer last year. And then when the president and his team came in, they asked, as did folks from the FCC, if we could convene a bipartisan commission and just do, frankly, a lot of work that was already underway outside of government, seeing if we could come up with some consensus solutions. And together with Margaret Spellings, who's the former Secretary of Education in the Bush II, and Jim Steyer, who's the founder and CEO of Common Sense Media, we did a dozen or so town hall meetings all around the country, most of them virtual, around the country, as well as overseas. We talked to a bunch of people in this room as well and took their input. And then we came up with a report with some, I think, very actionable recommendations, some of which were already underway. And I think the way I see the really, really important legislation that the senator has been working on and advancing is as a complement to some of the work that Senator Blumenthal and Blackburn, I think, are his.
On the App Store bill.
Exactly, and then the privacy work that Senators Markey and who's his.
Well, Blumenthal and Blackburn have one, and then Cantwell and Wicker.
Okay, and so and our real focus was the way in which I shouldn't say our only focus, but I think the thing that really moved me was the way in which disinformation has deepened divides. It's really what everybody's been talking about for the last couple of days, and many of you have been working on for a long, long time. I went to a conference in the summer of 2017. A group of former secretaries of state, national security advisors, that level of folks, and a couple of outsiders who still had their security clearance, and we got then the briefing on what we all now know about the extent of foreign involvement in the 2020 elections and just how it worked. And as a non-techie, I was fascinated with just how it happens. And I've been trying to understand that since, and frankly, the fact that we are divided is pretty troubling, but that it was so easy to divide us is part of what has bothered me so. Because it's not like the body politic was intact. It already had wounds. But what social media enables is the kind of picking at that scab until it's, folks knew just where those wounds were and how to exploit them. So when we just to a long way around to your question about the privacy part of this, and then I want to come back to the politics, Senator, because if this is on the other long list of things that the people want that don't happen, somebody has got to explain that to me.
Yeah.
But what has bothered me so much is that we're so stuck, and I understand why, on the content part, and I understand why that's hard. But the other part of it is that, whose data is it? What enables the micro-targeting? And how come we don't have more control over that and the ability to turn that dial on or off? And frankly, to know, and this is the transparency point, about how that data is harvested and how it's
So that's where you're focusing with this idea of that. One of the things that I think is really interesting is the noise around the First Amendment, free speech. Everything else drowns out really the real problem, which is power.
Yep.
And this is something you've written about in your giant antitrust bill, a book, excuse me. She wrote a huge book that you should get. It'll take you a very long time to read.
Well, I enjoyed it because, Mayor Pete and I had a bit of a rivalry on the debate stage.
Yeah.
And so Pete came out with a book called Trust right after the election. And then, not to be outdone, 6 months later, I came out with Antitrust.
Right. Yes. Yeah. In any case, nice joke. So when you're talking about this, you're talking about power. And we tend to get sucked up into discussions about things that are immediately problematic for people to agree on. To me, that's the whole point, is to get us to argue about the First Amendment and free speech, and not about concentration of power and the ability to manipulate people's information in order to do this. Now, listen, we've had conspiracy theories. I finally just finished, speaking of long books, the Hamilton book after 4 years of reading it. And finally, I got to the last page. It didn't end well for Hamilton. But it was the same thing then with pamphleteers, with misinformation, James Callender, all these things that were happening. So I'd love for each of you to talk about this idea of why do we tend to get wrapped up in the axle of disinformation, and which is essentially propaganda, and not where the problem is, which is about power. And this is what this bill deals with, which is gatekeepers. And allow it to become that discussion, because in that way it never gets to any resolution, because people are very emotional about the issue of free speech.
Well, may I?
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't think, I take your point that we get bogged down or tied up in the axle, as you say, of the speech issue. I think that the question of power is central, but you have to get at it more than one way. Due respect to the senator. I think that first of all, we have to acknowledge the incredible power that tech platforms have over everything today. And either, call it out and make peace with it, in which case I think we are deciding to be a different kind of country, or call it out and deal with it. And some of it is about getting right at the concentration of power. But if that's all we do, and I want to be careful not to be heard to minimize the significance of the antitrust part. But if we have 3 Facebooks doing the same thing one Facebook is doing, then what actually is it enough?
Because they could be different Facebooks.
Well, they could be. They could be. And Francis, I hope we'll talk about this later on. But I think the other thing is, I understand folks have talked about this earlier in the conference. Free speech is a constitutionally protected. It's not absolute, but it's a constitutionally protected right. There is no right to free reach, to limitless reach. There's no right, and we have gotten stuck on the speech and stopped when it comes to the reach. And the reach is about algorithms, and the algorithms depend on data, on what I was going to say what we tell, but frankly, we don't even tell. We get on the web, and all this stuff is harvested while we're trying to buy a pair of jeans. And at some point, as the non-techie in the commission, I kept saying, are we really just talking about the irritation of too many jeans ads? Once we buy the first, I mean, heard from one guy who said, I went online and bought a toilet seat, and I finally had to write to the company saying, I only needed one toilet seat. Stop advertising toilet seats. But when you understand that that data allows for the kind of targeting that completely distorts the reality, for example, for Spanish-speaking voters in southern Florida in the last election, that dials up the skepticism in black communities about the role of this or that initiative in government and its value to it. Look at what's happened with the pandemic.
Well,
Never
look,
in my wildest
in the
dreams.
pandemic, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
When you think about this power that's concentrated, it really is about that, correct?
So let me give you a few solutions. Antitrust is not the only solution, but I want you to think of it in one way as it relates to privacy. We will never know what Instagram or WhatsApp or some of these other companies, which were competitors of Facebook, could have done when it comes to the bells and whistles of security or privacy, because the free market isn't giving a chance because Facebook was buying everything.
That's right.
In Zuckerberg's own words in an email that was discovered by the House committees, I'd rather buy than compete. That's an exact quote. The other one I'll paraphrase because I don't have it exactly memorized, but the other quote was, these brands may be nascent to us, these brands may be nascent, but they could be disruptive to us. Disruption is supposed to be good in tech, right? You're supposed to have competition. So there is some market answers, since I'm at the University of Chicago, to some of this, which is to allow for more competition. The second piece is what Deval was getting at, which is this idea that yes, you can have free speech, yes, but at some point, if you have the power that Kara's talking about, and you're making money off that power, in the case of Facebook, $55 per users in North America in the first quarter of last year, well, much higher than other places that have more rules in place, then that you have to look at that as a factor. So the way I've described it to people that are not as into tech, if you yell fire in a crowded theater, right, that's not protected speech. And if the theater hasn't done stuff with exits and hasn't, well, they can be sued. Okay, but let's say they did. But what if it's worse than that? What if the theater actually has speakers in all their multiplexes and chooses to take the person yelling fire and broadcasts it in every single other theater? That's a whole different level of liability. So the issue is, and those solutions are several. You can regulate it, right, by saying we've got to look at what these algorithms are. We have to have transparency and make them public. We've got to let researchers look at what's happening so people understand it. I have no idea why my presence on Instagram goes up through the roof, or Twitter. I have some guesses. And Facebook just plods along. I don't know. I'd love to know, because it makes no sense at all. So having that kind of transparency, getting that out there and figuring out what you want to do with algorithms is one answer. And then the other answer is this immunity called Section 230. Right. We did make a carve out for sex trafficking stuff, so you could be basically sued for that, but we need to look at other forms of disinformation. Senator Warner, who's not exactly a radical liberal, has worked with me on that. He has a bill. We have another one on things like vaccine misinformation, but the question is how far you go in terms of getting rid of that immunity. But that, to me, is the ultimate weapon, and especially if they just keep fighting every single thing that you try to do.
Well, I mean, and here's one other problem with power. Power, concentrated as it is the reason we haven't had the bills that the senator and others are working on enacted.
Well, it's also another thing, it's consumers, right? One of the things Margaret Vester talks about is you're all trading convenience for what you're giving away. I use a different term. I'm like Soylent Green is people, which young people don't get that reference, but anyone who's, and it was with Charlton Heston, is the idea that we are the product of these people. We're what's being eaten and made into crackers to feed everybody else. So, which is kind of gross, but talk a little bit about that. You said 2,700 lobbyists. They're pushing against you. Some of the arguments they're making are, what I think is, it's sort of modified Orban is how I would look at it, is I can keep you safe. I can make everything interoperate. I make your map goes with your phone, goes with your this. I can coordinate software and services. I can coordinate the device. look at when you put on the AirPod, it works immediately, which we all like, which we all find wonderful in a lot of ways. So talk a little bit about the idea, their argument that they keep us safer, one, and then two, if you do this, Senator Klobuchar, all hell is breaking loose on the internet. That's one of their arguments. And the last thing is during the pandemic, we've all gotten, one of the things I wrote before the pandemic is you think they're powerful now, they're going to be enormously powerful at the end of this thing and richer than ever, which they are. How do you push back at the idea that we're not better off in this paternalistic idea of a walled garden where we are all safe and they protect us and they are liked, or Prime is going to blow up. That's one of the arguments, that if Senator Klobuchar's bill goes through, Amazon Prime doesn't happen.
Well, thanks for that series of softball questions. I will say I want people to have some perspective. Whenever a bill gets closer to getting passed, you get the apocalypse argument. And that happened with Obamacare. Yep. I don't know if David's around here, but that happened big time with Obamacare. And now everyone loves it. It happens with Medicare, way back, with the American Medical Association. Now they love it. It happened with the Dodd-Frank bill. It happened in Europe with the privacy bill. So I want you to have some perspective on, it's an argument that's used in the political context. Secondly, so some of these arguments, they have many of them, can be batted down quite simply. I love the argument that we would get rid of Amazon Prime. That is like saying we're going to get rid of apple pie, right? Oh my God. Not only do we have a specific exemption so it doesn't touch subscription services, but one of their own lobbyists made the mistake of telling a Hill newspaper at the Capitol Hill that was a lie. So that was a little bit of a problem.
And the idea is that you can choose from delivery services. You don't have to have
Yes,
Amazon.
exactly. It's just, okay, the second argument is that it somehow will blow up national security.
Encryption.
And by the way, we have a safe harbor in the bill. We had one to begin with, but now we've even made it broader that says that if you take measures for security or privacy, that's fine. That's not going to trigger any kind of problem for you under this bill. And I have had national security experts, both inside and major ones in government, because I said, if we have a problem, we want to know, so please tell us. We're never going to do anything to hurt national security. Look at this. They have people saying that it does make a problem, but I will note they are all like former CIA agents who are on their payroll, all right, that go and talk to senators. And so then I have to go with the real people that are there and have them counter it, including Mark Warner, who heads up the Intelligence Committee of the U.S. Senate, who is on the bill. So that's another argument they make. A third argument that they make is that it somehow hurts our American competitiveness. I love that we have these products and these employees, and I'm not a Neanderthal, see, look. I have iPhones myself. I like how it works. It's a great company, right? But we're not destroying the company or their interconnectivity. We're just letting others have an opportunity to compete in whatever product line that it is. So I think that is a better way to think of it. And they don't really want that competition. Right now, Google and Apple charge 30% for certain companies on their app store. And it's very unfair. It takes a lot to get Match.com to come testify at a hearing. But they did, because they don't think it's fair that they pay 30% and Uber doesn't. Like, why? Mike Lee asked, well, why is that? And they go, well, because one's cars and one's dating. Those are the kinds of things that are going on right now. And so putting in some rules of the road is how I talk about it for the app stores and for overall these major gatekeeper platforms is the least that we should be doing.
Is there one persuasive argument they have that you think works very well? The safety argument, right?
I can't. It has changed a number of times. They're running multiple ads in Washington, D.C. You guys probably don't see them. They are targeted at the 500 plus members of Congress. They run constantly against the bill. It makes me feel very powerful, honestly. But they are doing that. They also make some free speech arguments. And they have a lot of power. I don't want to underestimate it. And I actually have worked with them before. I'm a big fan of immigration reform. And they are good on those issues. Many of them have worked on climate change. technology, STEM, apprenticeships, you name it. So I am not someone that has demonized these companies, but I am someone that believes in capitalism. I am someone that believes that America, one of the reasons we have this incredible economy is that we rejuvenate it, and that going back in time to the founding fathers, who they came over looking for political freedom, yes, religious freedom, remember the Pilgrims, but also economic freedom. They didn't want to buy all their tea from one tea company. They don't want to have to be beholden to all these monopolies. And when this has come up, whether it's a Republican senator, Senator Sherman passing the Sherman Act, whether it's Teddy Roosevelt riding into the White House on his anti-monopoly horse, our country really across the aisle, which is what's so great about right now, AT&T case brought over many administrations, making AT&T, by their own chairman's words, stronger when they came out of it. It has been something that's been bipartisan. So I find it interesting that under Macon Delrahim and Chairman Simon of the FTC during the Trump administration, they started these suits. And they're being continued by the Biden administration, Justice Department and FTC. So this is something that has actually crossed party lines in terms of people realizing it's a problem when you have moms that can't control what their kids are watching or seeing on the internet. And my last story I'll tell, one mom told me it was like water's coming out of a sink, and she's got 3 kids, and she can't control any of it, and she just feels like she's mopping it up, and it keeps coming out of the spout, and she can't control it. That's how people are feeling.
You can throw
right
your
now.
phone in the sink.
But Tara, may I just on this point about the consumer mood has shifted too. Once upon a time, those arguments that big tech made about convenience, I think it was a decade ago, 70% of Americans said they were willing to share or give up their personal privacy in the interest of that convenience. That's completely flipped now. It's in the 90% range, and I mean among everybody, Democrats, independents, Republicans. People understand, and parents understand, to the senator's last point, understand how vulnerable we all are, how much destruction happens because of the wild, wild web. And we don't it doesn't have to be wild. We don't have to sacrifice innovation in order to have more moderation in that marketplace.
So talk a little bit about government power, though. I just interviewed Lena Khan, who's one of the first long interviews she gave about it. And one of the things that I came away with is we're too small, the U.S. government, to deal with these companies. And it was really, whether it's money to have lawyers, whether it's persuasion with the populace who likes these things and are dependent, because you've got an industry that is not just popular and convenient, it's necessary and it's addictive at all the different things. It's unavoidable in some ways, and people love it, kind of love it in the way you would, I often say my best relationship is with my iPhone, which I shouldn't say, that's mean to my family. But when you think about the idea of government not being popular, now there's a lot of states where you formerly was governor, Maura Healey's trying to sue, states attorneys general are trying to sue. Everyone's trying to get at this a different way. Is our government too weak to control these companies? The top 10 richest companies in the world are tech companies. The top 10 richest people in the world are tech people, except for Saudi Aramco, I think, the list I just saw. How is government capable of pushing back this? Oil was one thing. Is it capable of pushing back this power at all?
Yes, but
yes.
It's rusty.
Yeah.
I'll give you the numbers. Antitrust Division, 453 lawyers in 1980, 330 by 2017. And think of how much more consolidation we're seeing and how more complex these cases are. FTC, 1,719 employees in 1980, 1,100 in 2018. And so one of the things that there is bipartisan agreement on is beefing up these agencies. And you can actually do it by how you change merger fees, so it's not on the taxpayers' backs. And the other crazy thing is these agencies bring in money when they bring these suits.
But this
and bring
bill did
these
not
actions.
pass, right? It was part of it.
No, it has passed the Senate. It's Klobuchar-Grassley, and it brings in over $100 million for them. It passed the Senate. It is going to pass in part of that semiconductor bill. That's where it's sitting in a safe place. And so I will do an interview where I will admit I was wrong with you on your podcast if it doesn't pass by 4th of July.
Okay. All right.
So we
You know,
all
Nancy
know.
Pelosi made a promise like that. I guarantee you Hillary Clinton's going to win. I was like, I don't.
Okay, well, I did not make that promise. So,
Right, okay.
But I actually completely believe that we need more funding for these agencies. I think that we have people in charge now with Lena, with Jonathan Cantor over in Justice, Tim Wu over in the White House who really get it. And there's this new energy around that, and they're hiring new lawyers and new people that are coming in. I think that's really an exciting piece of this. And I just think that the president and the White House are devoted to doing something about this. So it's just a whole thing without just making it all political, attacking this company or another, as you saw some during the Trump administration. See how nice I was about that? Yet their Justice Department did, near the end there, bring a major suit, which I think was helpful. So that is, that's what's going on. I agree that it's been difficult, but I think the government's more than up to it. And I think the citizens are ready for the government to act.
Yes.
So Deval, finish up. We're going to get questions from the audience in a second. When you think about governing, I find these people ungovernable, unaccountable, and unreachable on some level, and amusing. You know, Elon Musk is amusing everyone with the Twitter thing, or likable. Some people think he's a villain, but they like that too, in some weird way. Do you think government is up to the task of doing what needs to be done without overreaching?
So first of all, government in a functioning democracy is what we say it is. We say it is. And if we want government to reflect our values, then we've got to show up. We've got to vote for the folks who are showing that kind of leadership, and we have to devote the resources. And I think we have some very practical ways, including the ones that the senator just referred to do that. And to be clear, the tech leaders that we've dealt with, and we talked to all of them in the course of our work on the commission, they also acknowledge it's time for regulation. They're very general about that when they're talking to us, but they are on record with us and with others that it's time to put some guardrails. Most of what the Senate has been talking about, Amy, correct me if I'm wrong, is not the sort of doomsday stuff where, you know, we have to have enough people to review every tweet before it is approved to go on to be reposted or what have you. It's nothing like that. It's some basic rules of the road. These are the behaviors we expect. You step across those lines and there will be consequences. We have done that over and over and over again in this country successfully without destroying industry, which nobody I don't want to do, and I know the senator and most of her colleagues don't want to do. So we should just get over, you know, whether it's going to be perfect on the other end. We did healthcare reform in Massachusetts before there was an Obamacare. 98.5% of our residents are insured. We didn't get it wrong get it all right with the first bill. We had this coalition that stuck together. We kept going back and refining. We got at costs and so on. And we passed other bills. And that will happen here too.
Exactly. One other thing is the court decisions, which you know about. We're not going to go in deep here, but over the years have sort of really clawed away at the Clayton Act and at the Sherman Act, and really taken it away from their original meaning toward since we're in Chicago again, the Bork theories of the world. And so I think that also has played a role in making it very necessary to fine-tune these laws. And I say fine-tune because over time in America, we have never gone this long without making a change to the antitrust laws to meet the time. So that's contributing to some of this as well. I don't know how long it's been, but
there's a thing that happens.
I'm just counting how many days before I pass this.
Okay, all right, I can't wait. We're going to go out. We're going to go drinking. Okay. All right, right here. Right here, great.
Thank you. My name is Gabriele, and I'm a Master of Public Policy student at the University of Chicago, here at the Harris School of Public Policy. And my question is about antitrust. I'm interested in antitrust, and the last time the Sherman Act was 120 years ago, and around the antitrust of the Sherman Act, there was a lot of momentum. So I'm glad that there's momentum right now. Like a lot of people are talking.
They had presidential campaign songs about antitrust.
And do you have one?
No,
You'd
no.
like to sing? Okay.
Woodrow Wilson had one. All right.
So, when we talk about antitrust, a lot of the cases are about quantity, price, and quality. And price is stuck at 0 for social media. Quantity, there's a lot of it, but quality is very hard to measure. So my question is, like, how do you measure quality in social media?
Mm-hmm.
No.
Well, I think I like that. I like that question because so much of antitrust, just what he's pointed out here, is all about prices. And we know that sometimes even prices can fool you because they stay low, and then once a monopoly is a monopoly, then they can raise the price, and all of a sudden everyone's saying, why is the price so high? I don't have any other place to go. So that is one measure, but it is not the only measure. And when you talk about quality in this context, to me it means, are you getting your data ripped off? Are things staying private? Are you being, what kind of content are you getting? Are you getting
Is it
accurate
safe for children, for example?
information? Yeah, right. Are you getting accurate information? And how do you evaluate that? And the focus of this conference is, of course, disinformation. And I hope some of my solutions here are private sector solutions, but there's also a lot of education that goes on. I spent a lot of time in the Baltics, actually, with Senator McCain at one point, right after Donald Trump got elected. Just recently, I went to Ukraine, and those countries have been dealing with this disinformation well before we were, because
They
Russia
were the
was.
test cases.
They were the test cases. Estonia had their entire internet set cut off once because they moved a statue, a military statue that Russia didn't like that they moved it, and they just shut down their internet. And so this has been going on, ads and things, including in the Scandinavian countries, and their citizenry understands what it is. They know that it's the Russian parties. And you see this in a big way right now with the disinformation going on that tempted by the Russians with the Nazi arguments and the like in Ukraine. And I was so glad to see Chris here because he laid the groundwork for what has become a much more robust American effort at fighting back at this in Ukraine. And Ukrainians have done, well, beyond the obvious and the courage and just this, putting themselves in front of tanks and regular people just standing up and getting killed for their country and our democracy. They've done an incredible job online. Some of it is Zelensky himself and the creativity of it, seeing what modern warfare is about, but it's also the help he's gotten from the rest of the world, not just the US, in putting the intel out right away so everyone believed us, right? Putin was lying, and everyone believed us because we got it out. Not everyone, but most people did. We were able to unite Europe. We were able to get the information out to Ukrainians. We're able to now get some information out to some of the Russians. So I bring that up because when you ask about the quality of the internet, all of that has to do with that. And some of these companies have helped. Microsoft has greatly helped on that. By the way, Microsoft endorsed our bill, so there. But also some of the other companies that we're talking about today have helped. But to me, that's great. But then let's see what they can do here.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. Where's it right here? Sorry, this woman right here. I like to mix it up.
Hi there, my name is Juliana. I'm a fourth year in the college. So in the previous panel, we talked a little bit about political violence, and as I'm sure you all know, algorithms make it so that we see kind of more of what we like, and that makes political violence a little more likely. So I was wondering if you could talk about the ways in which big tech and legislation can potentially help to curb some of this polarization that we see online and political violence in turn.
Gus, that's a big question.
Yes, it is a big...
I mean, enragement equals engagement, if you could keep that in mind. But go ahead.
That is the equation. That's the business model right now. And that's exactly the proposals we've made through the commission and is in companion legislation, if I can describe it that way, Senator, elsewhere in the Senate and in the House gets at this idea. It's not that we are trying to say that you shouldn't say inflammatory things. We're not going to be able to regulate decorum. I wish we could, but, well, I shouldn't even say that, because others would try to regulate my decorum, and I wouldn't have that. I wish we had what we used to call in the old neighborhood more house training among people who express themselves publicly. But this idea that inflammatory language, that bad behavior gets blown out to everybody. And by the way, if you say something moderating, that does not get the same treatment.
Well, as he and I know, because we say more moderate.
Exactly. But it's not purely a selfish thing, but the algorithm favors and looks for outrage and pushes that out. And it doesn't just push it out to everybody, it pushes it out to a profile created by the aggregation of a whole bunch of our personal data. Most of us didn't even realize we're in that bucket for evaluation. So we can get at that by giving the people control of our privacy, and why shouldn't we?
I would make a suggestion for you. If you said it and did an air fryer video at the same time, you might get a lot more engagement.
Also look for the Honest Ads Act. That was something I did with McCain and Mark Warner. Now Lindsay is on it. At the beginning, the social media companies pushed back at that so hard that all that said was you had to have a disclosure and disclaimer paid for by on the ads, and they pushed back at that. They later said they were for it, but by then the damage was done, honestly, and we still haven't passed that.
And an awful lot of damage, too.
Okay.
Ads on their platforms.
Right. Well, one last question, right back there.
Hi, thank you all for coming. My question is for Congresswoman Klobuchar.
No, Senator.
Senator.
No, that's good.
So my apologies. You introduced the bill that you talked about today that would punish social media companies like Facebook and Twitter for having health misinformation on their platforms. And I'm going to ask you, if I were to say that there are only two sexes, male and female, would that be considered misinformation that you think should be banned speech on social media platforms?
Okay. I'm not going to get into what misinformation. First of all, I think the bill you're talking about is different than the one we've mostly been talking about. So I want to make that clear. We've been talking about the competition bill, but there is another bill that I have on vaccine misinformation. It is that specific in a public health crisis. You wonder why you get that specific. It's because we're trying to find carve-outs that I did this was with Ben Ray Lujan, that got to that you can't have immunity as a social media company if you are broadcasting vaccine misinformation. There is another bill that Mark Warner did that is about just misinformation in general and hate speech and those kinds of things. And I think one of the things Deval is getting at is that a lot of times the content fight, and Kara was getting at this, starts to dominate the world here. And one of the things that I have been so actually heartened by with some of my Republican co-sponsors on this bill, who have different views than me on some of the internet content issues, have united on that this is a good place to start in terms of, and not try to make it into some of these disputes about the internet. And so that's why we are focused on competition policy right
Okay, I'm going to ask one last quick question, so we got to go. Is if you could pick one thing that would be the most important thing to pass, that you could do this yourself, you are king or queen of the internet. And you can pick whichever one you want.
Well, I'm sitting right here with Senator Klobuchar, so I have to say her bill. I would love to see the antitrust and privacy bills consolidated. I'd take that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, what about you?
Well, that's a good idea. I mean, I practically, I'm a pragmatic progressive, so of course I want to pass my bill, But I think if we could add a few things to it, whether privacy is most likely in the Senate on a separate track, but the newspaper bill. My dad, we lost my dad this year at age 93. He was a reporter his whole life. I am devoted to the idea of the First Amendment. We've been losing local news, small news, left and right, all over this country. And what this does is it just says the smaller news organizations, that's the bill we are now refining right now, not the biggest ones, the smaller ones, can combine their might, their limited might, to try to negotiate for, say, a 4 or 5 year period, prices with the tech companies when they put their content up. Because right now, it's basically minimizing the value of their content, and then we're losing those that are investigating city council scandals, because maybe people are going to cover scandals in Washington, but they're not going to cover small news if you don't have it, and it's not small for a democracy, right? Or a high school football game, or a new development at a town library. These kinds of things, they need to be covered. People need to have a shared understanding of what's happening in their community to be able to be part of that community. So I feel really strongly about that legislation and the value of the First Amendment and news, because this is about disinformation, and if you break down and you don't have actual news coverage and actual reporters, you become a cesspool of disinformation. And so I would love to include that bill. And that bill has been supported by McConnell in the past. I've got a number of different people that are supporting that bill, and Cicilline and Buck are doing in the House. And Senator Kennedy of Louisiana, best accent in the Senate, he's the lead on that bill, actually. So,
all right. Excellent, and I'm excited to get her Christmas card where she says,
okay, and I want to thank The Atlantic, which I said I would do, Jeffrey, as well as the University of Chicago. I loved going here for law school. It changed my life. And the Institute and David for sponsoring this. It's been a fantastic discussion.
well, I wonder if you'll amount to anything. Anyway, thank you so much.
You just stop it. 4th of July. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage our next panel, Countering Disinformation's Threat to National Security, with former U.S. Representative from Texas, Will Hurd, U.S. Representative from Michigan, Elissa Slotkin, and moderated by Jeffrey Goldberg, Editor-in-Chief of The Atlantic.
Is this on? Now it is. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you for sticking with us. We've had a good conference. I'm sorry that you didn't. I guess you have other things to do or something, but we've had a really good conference, and we're glad that you're here today. We're going to have try to have a fast-paced and very large conversation, not merely about disinformation in national security, but it's a great moment in the history of the planet to talk about foreign policy resetting. Vladimir Putin has reminded the world about certain immutable truths of human relations, and we need to fold that into what we talk about. And so I don't want to disaggregate disinformation from everything else that's going on. Obviously, it's everywhere, and it has impacts that we can see and not see, and so we'll get through it. But I thought, since we have both of you here, and in addition to having served in Congress and serving in Congress, both of these folks are veterans of the intelligence community professionals. It might be interesting to get you talking for just a minute or two about the Ukraine invasion, what it means for United States national security, what it means for Russian and American reputations around the world in crucial parts of the world, and obviously fold in your analysis of disinformation and its role in everything that's happened to date. But maybe we start with you, Congressman Slotkin, just to talk about maybe start with what surprised you the most about the events of the last month and a half, and where you think this puts America vis-a-vis Russia and vis-a-vis Europe.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here with my friend Will Hurd, who I served with for one term. So I think, particularly related to the events of this conference, what was super interesting to start off with about this invasion of Ukraine was what the administration did to try and forestall it, right? To try and stop it. The release of very large amounts of classified information, declassifying it, and trying to expose the Russian misinformation and disinformation was more aggressive than I had seen before. And as a CIA officer, you're certainly taught, do not declassify information.
It freaked out. Did it freak you guys out at all that they were just pumping this stuff out? Sources and methods and possible compromise?
Certainly I wondered if we were blowing sources as we were releasing the information, but I thought it was an interesting approach to try and counter the Russian narratives that Ukraine was a threat to them, that it was an existential issue for them, and that it was done for these pure and reasonable reasons. And I think they tried. It didn't work, but they tried. And I think my guess is that's one of the first times in history that we've really had a campaign of releasing classified information or declassified information like that. I think what has surprised me, or what I've noticed since the invasion, is that a whole new generation of people who didn't grow up as Cold War kids, as I did, I'm 45, anyone my age or older grew up kind of thinking about nuclear possibilities with Russia. A whole new generation is realizing that there are still really nasty leaders out there who do terrible things. And I think that's reset the conversation for a lot of people who maybe had strong feelings about American foreign policy, but certainly are now seeing that it's not like other actors don't take it 10 steps further. And I think I represent Michigan State, and that's been an interesting conversation to have as they're watching a war unfold on social media.
Right.
So I think the most surprising thing for me is the need to rethink a lot of assumptions that we have made about ourselves, about our allies, and about our adversaries. This notion, everybody thought that the Ukrainians weren't going to be able to hold their own. wait a minute, in 2014, they actually pushed the Russians out away from Kyiv when they were not as prepared. What is Vladimir Putin actually willing to do? What is the Western alliance willing to do when it comes like that? There's actually a level of cohesiveness that many of us didn't expect was there. And so I think that is the question. On the intelligence sharing and information, I would say it was an attempt to engage in the information space, which is a positive thing. But if you're sharing, and I was less concerned about the kind of information that was being shared because it was about something, about movements on a battlefield, about things that are about to happen. I don't think many of that stuff revealed some of the more secret and the more nuanced sources and methods that we have. It was equivalent of making public things that we have shared with our allies in other phases. And that's not to just diminish what had happened, but we have to engage in that information space. The ability of the Russians, and I've talked about this during my entire career, to push a narrative. The fact that we're actually talking about Nazis still is mind-boggling to me. And the fact that is a narrative in a lot of conservative circles is quite shocking to me. But we also have to think what the Chinese are trying to do to weaponize what's happening now. They keep talking about the 140 countries that are part of the UN that are not participating in these sanctions with Russia. That's not disinformation. That's a fact. But what does that actually mean? And we have to start countering that narrative as well too.
It's something slightly more subtle than disinformation. It's ordering a set of facts in such a way as to
100%.
make a plausible but actually completely irrelevant point.
But the information space is a domain that we have to fight in. Public diplomacy is a domain. It's something we need to get better at, and something that we have used successful in previous conflicts. All stuff's connected.
I guess I want to level set a little bit and talk about your definitions of disinformation, but let me just stay on that for 1 second because it's interesting. Do you think that we should, both of you, do you both think that we should fight disinformation with disinformation? In other words, to put it bluntly, screw with Russia the way they screw with us?
No.
Why not?
And look, why not? Because your values, your actions need to be based on your values. And if you value freedom, if you value transparency, if you value authority, then you can't deviate from that. And guess what? It's easier to lie. Some version of this quote has been around for like 2,000 years. A lie travels faster than the truth. The lie gets somewhere before the truth can put its pants on, right? Whatever that quote is. That's been around for a really long time. But we have to be disciplined and stick to our values, and the rest of the world has to see that we are look, this is actually a chapter in my book. Your audio and your video have to match. The things you say and the things you do have to match the things you say.
And I would say when a democracy attempts to use false information, even if it's for a good cause, it ends up boomeranging on you, and it undercuts the very thing you're trying to promote. I do think, though, and we have a long history in the United States, particularly during the Cold War, of kind of the version of what China does, highlighting the facts that we think are really important, right? Think about all the radio stations and the newspapers and the things that we placed and paid for during the Cold War in order to tell the story that we wanted to tell about democracy and America. I don't have a problem with that, and I think if you talk to folks who are immigrants from Eastern Europe, they'll say that was a critical lifeline for them to understand something different than what they were being told by their dictator or by the Communist Party. So I don't have a problem with that, but it has to be factual. And I think where democracies get into real trouble is when in the cause of freedom, they tell a bunch of lies, it just boomerangs on them, and you lose the faith of the people you're trying to message.
Right, and we've let those muscles atrophy a little bit over the past 30 years, especially. We come back to that, but staying on this question of what authoritarian countries do. Maybe you can both share with us who you think are the major threats in the disinformation space, and rank order them, and where you put China and its level of sophistication, Russia, Iran. Give us the. Let's imagine you're still working in Langley, and somebody asks you, like, where are the main disinformation nodes that we have to combat and be aware of? How do you do those definitions? Either one of you.
I mean, I think it's interesting. I think Russia, while they're often ham-handed at what they do, they certainly use it as a major tool in their toolkit. They are, and they're getting better, right? We saw them interfere in our election in 2016, and when we actually dug into it, you know, what did they actually do? It was some pretty ham-handed stuff, but that's just an opportunity for them to learn and grow. I think China has capability, but doesn't explore as much in that space, but they are the long game in my mind on the issue of disinformation and misinformation. Like, Russia's the short-term tactical problem right in front of us, but the long game is 100%, I think, the Chinese. And then there are other actors who may try. We've seen some stuff from Iran, we've seen some stuff from North Korea, but it's largely small ball stuff. China, to me, is where the real game is.
Look, I completely agree. I second everything the distinguished woman from the great state of Michigan has just said.
Just practicing for your next
your
return.
So capabilities and willingness to use those capabilities. Yep. China has greater capabilities, but they are less willing to use those capabilities than what the Russians are. What do the Russians have to lose? The Russians have perfected tactics, techniques, and procedures over the last 40 years on how to weaponize information. So they're really good at it, but at times super ham-handed. We have to assume. I'm on the board of a company that just released a tool this week that you can Google, or you put in text to say, create an impressionist image of the Mona Lisa as painted by watercolor. 2 seconds later, you get 40 images. What the heck? Like, it's crazy, right? And it looks good. So imagine the Chinese have this tool. We limit the use of this for faces and for individuals to try to prevent deep fakes. But imagine some of the tools and the tactics that the Russians are using now, and you have this powered by technology and being able to use deep fakes. How is that going to impact our society? We also have to look at what is, like, the thing that has been fascinating to me through all of this with Ukraine. Russia in Latin America. RT Latin America in Spanish has greater reach than RT itself did at its height. What the narratives that the Russians are pushing in our own Western Hemisphere is not being countered, and it's growing at a huge rate. We wonder why many Latin and Central and South American countries aren't as active in our efforts to prevent the Russians from getting out of Ukraine. So the Russians are using these tools now. They are the folks that we have to be focused on, but the long-term fight is absolutely the Chinese government.
And so I think what's interesting, let's take RT as a perfect example, right? So you could be driving between Chicago and Detroit, stop overnight at a Howard Johnson's in Indiana, and watch RT 6 weeks ago. It was part of many, many cable packages. And that, in my mind, is just a propaganda arm of the Russian government. It's paid for by the Russian government, meets the standard definition, but you could go watch it at a Howard Johnson. We tried, when the Mueller report came out, there was a group of us who really dug in, like, how do we get at RT? How do we prevent them from being on the airwaves?
You don't see this as a free speech issue?
No, not when it's paid for by a foreign government. If that same content was being produced by an American company, we've got a whole First Amendment, Second Amendment problem there, First Amendment problem. Sorry, not Second Amendment.
Eventually, you might have a Second Amendment problem.
We want no Second Amendment problems. But because it was paid for by the Russians, that was the hook, right, for us to try and do something. We looked, we tried, we had all kinds of exploration into this on a bipartisan basis, and couldn't manage what the private cable companies in the United States did in 1 week after the invasion. The Russians go into Ukraine, and all these private cable companies decided, you know what, I'm not going to be responsible for peddling this stuff, and they cut them off. And now you can't see that RT on Howard Johnson's, on the TV. So I think the other super interesting thing about what's going on between Russia and Ukraine is the role of the private sector and how that's affecting national security, right? When Visa and PayPal and McDonald's willingly, without any guidance or push from the White House, shut down operations in Russia, that has more daily effect on the lives of a Russian citizen than probably at this point anything we're doing in sanctions. So I think that is just it's an aside that the private sector is in this space with us, and I think has a growing role in playing a part in national security.
Right. And look, I'm glad all those companies did that, right? But here's what's happened. Those same reporters that were on RT that were tweeting with an RT handle are now in other places, at other, where the First Amendment issue becomes a challenge because it is at a U.S. American.
Are you advocating doing something about them?
No, I'm saying it makes this problem even more difficult because the folks metastasize. Now you can say, hey, focus on this one place, RT, what they're doing at RT. Now they're at different places, and do you always know that this was a former reporter at RT that's still pushing some of the same narratives that they have, which makes this fight even more difficult. But guess what? We got to keep doing it. What I find another thing that was valuable and interesting in all this, when this first, I'm pretty aggressive with what I think the United States of America should be doing to help our Ukrainian brothers and sisters. And when I came out really early on, my former staff reached out to me and they're like, boss, man, you're a little aggressive, right?
Did you say, and you're a little former?
Yeah, no. Look, they're looking out for me. They're like, hey, this is not where the public is. But guess what? When reporters started sending back the images and showing what's happening, you have seen a change in public opinion in the United States about how bad what is happening in Ukraine. And so it's an opportunity. We talk about all the negative things that are hard around this, but public opinion swung pretty quickly when you showed the truth, right? And did it in a way that hit people in the face. And so there have been some positives of changing and influencing public opinion in the right direction.
And actually, that's a perfect example of, I think Americans are very empathetic. They do see these images, especially young people, where they can see someone their age, 13 years old in a bunker with their dog doing a TikTok on what it's like to live underground. I think it affects us in a way that I'm proud of, right? I'm glad that we feel empathy. But on the other side, there's so many conflicts around the world, right, that don't get exposure. You can't get a camera in. I was mentioning to you beforehand an incident that happened when I was speaking to a class and a Uyghur student stood up. And she's like, my brother's been detained for 4 years. I'm watching the entire world feel sympathy for the Ukrainians. How come I can't get this for the Uyghurs? And we started talking about it, and part of it is you don't have that footage, that camera inside those detention centers that are focusing on the plight of the Uyghurs. So information is still very much a weapon and a way to get Americans rallied around a
Well,
cause.
talk about that, because I do want to hear what you think some of the solutions are, obviously. And we talked about sort of the withering of American, I don't want to call it propaganda, but state-supported but transparent journalism efforts to tell people what the world looks like from the American perspective. Is there more that the United States government, Congress, should be doing for blasting out information at Chinese and Asian audiences about what's actually happening in Xinjiang? How much? Talk about some of the solutions. Countering disinformation with information seems like where you're both going. But how much can we do, and how effective would it be?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Countering it with information is part of it, and that's why, I mean, we still have things that are basically the son of, you know, Radio Free Europe. We still have these arms that put out information about what's going on in the world that's different than what you can get in the local, you know, whatever country you're in. But I do think that there's some cleanup that has to be done around regulating particularly foreign media in the United States, right? To me, it was crazy that I couldn't say RT is an arm of the Russian government. They're paid for by the Russians. That should be shut down by the FEC, right? That's where is the play there? And it's because we stopped making kind of laws around propaganda when the Cold War started to ebb. I mean, years before, actually. So I think there's a lot of cleanup we can do, and not just for TV. We were talking about newsprint, digital. You know, Facebook made a decision after 2016 that, whoops, it's probably not a good idea if foreign governments get to buy ad space on Facebook. And they didn't, no one forced them to do that. They just got embarrassed enough that they did it. But I think it would be useful to have some laws around not being able to buy airtime and ad time as a foreign entity. I think that's a basic place.
Sounds like a slippery slope, though, no?
Look, I think the real answer, this is a good CIA answer, it depends, right? And
that's why you guys always got paid the moderate bucks, right?
Real moderate.
Yeah. So look, when you're talking about disinformation on its own, you have actors' behaviors and you have the content. There are certain actors that are easier to deal with because when they're foreign. Like disinformation by foreign actors is a much easier issue to deal with, as we've already discussed. You can talk about the behaviors that they're using, the tools, the tactics that they're using. The platforms can figure that out, identify this. After the 2016 election, I think the Senate report on what happened, went into some good examples. There's a number of entities that have shown how these tools are being used. Can you tweak or make sure you're identifying when those tools are being used in methods that we know bad actors are using? We can address that. Is Twitter and Facebook content providers? And yes. This is not a hard question, right? And I think knowing what we know now, we wouldn't have had to carve out for them when this was first started and say, you're just like newspapers, you're just like TV, you're just like a print. Is there the political will to do that or change that? I don't know what the answer is. But the way you fight an information war is with actual deeds. The longer if we use Ukraine as the example, the longer this conflict goes on, the more pressure you're going to see our Eastern European partners be under, because they have populations that are living under the threat of war. They have, the closer you are to Russia, the more impact sanctions are to you, and you're dealing with a humanitarian crisis that's growing. Those governments are going to feel pressure from that. The populations are going to get frustrated because they feel like they're being drowned out. Then you're going to see the Russians say, hey, the reason you're having problems in Poland is because of these Ukrainians. And so what are we doing now to get ahead of that issue? Like, why? Everybody wants to use a Marshall Plan for everything, right? But this is where an actual Marshall Plan modeled on the previous Marshall Plan to talk about the rebuilding of Ukraine can start now. And you do it in Slovenia, you do it in Poland, you do it in Moldova, so that you start helping to support those governments who are dealing with the aftermath of this, so that we get ahead of this narrative that's going to be pushed the longer this war goes. Because ultimately, what is Vladimir Putin trying to do? Two things: stay in power until he dies, reestablish the territorial integrity of the USSR, and they're doing that and how do you how do you do that? Make sure NATO isn't as strong. So if you increase some of those friction points, you're going to see that Western alliance.
But let me just come back and push against a point you both made before. This is old as the Bible. By way of deception, you shall do war, right? America has a long history, like many other countries, of using deceptive methods to convince enemies that we're stronger than they are, that we're here when we're actually there, and so on. So what is the problem of an American company making a deepfake video of a Russian general saying whatever they're putting in his mouth that might cause morale to ebb with his soldiers in Ukraine? Beats the hell out of droning him to death. I mean, that's certainly killing people is more severe than making fake videos about them. So why would you be so hesitant to use deceptive methods?
Real simple, because that's going to get back into the American population, right? And so when you look at blowback, in 9.5 years I was involved. I may or may not have been involved in some covert action, okay? And one of the things you always evaluate is what is the potential blowback within American society in English language print. Doing something like that in this interconnected world where bits can move so fast, the fact that something like that would get back, and you should not be doing anything to your own population to mislead them or tell them wrong. That's why you shouldn't do it.
And there's a big difference between like creating, the only options are not creating a deep fake or, as you say, droning someone to death, right? I mean, there's stuff in the middle.
You don't like my verb? My
I don't love the verb. But I think the truth is, if you want to affect the morale of the Russian soldiers, especially the conscripts who are on the ground right now in Ukraine, you don't need a deep fake of Vladimir Putin. You just need to show them what's actually happening on the battlefield. The fact that they can't get food, water, and fuel more than 180 miles from their border. So I would rather, I'm with Will. I think that if you start, if the American public said, oh Lord, our own government is making deep fakes of someone else, what's to keep them from doing a deep fake of Joe Biden or somebody else that they like or don't like? To me, it just undermines trust, and we're already in a tough place.
Yeah, no, I mean, I actually agree with you, but I mean, I'm wondering if the horse is already out of the barn on that question.
We have to adhere to our values. Why was everybody criticizing President Biden about the in comment in his speech? Most people were criticizing him because that is going to be weaponized and used within Russian society to confirm their suspicions that, America is trying to tell you who your leader should be, right? No Russian, even if they dislike Vladimir Putin, wants to be told who their leader is, right? And so if you do something like that on purpose, with the intention to change, it's going to have a negative effect, and it's not.
There's something that I don't understand. We've talked about this before. There's something I don't understand. There's an interesting analog between this. Let's use this deep fake question and all of the other challenges we're facing in the future of warfare: augmented soldiers, augmented humans, transhumanism, and all of the threats. And we know, I mean, this is not a subject of this conference, but we know that when China develops the technological capability to augment born-style soldiers, they're not going to sit around and have long colloquies about the morals and ethics and the doubts and the shades of gray. Authoritarian governments tend to just do the thing that's most effective for their immediate goals. So then our Pentagon, our defense establishment has the same challenge. Like, the Chinese now have augmented soldiers and we don't. So, and then we're going to have this conversation. This comes back to something that you were telling me, which is that we're always on the back foot, a democracy, when it's fighting an authoritarian government. So my question is, how do you even out? And I understand we have ideals, and the moral arc of the universe is long and it bends toward justice, but sometimes it doesn't. How do you actually create a level playing field when one party will use disinformation and one party just won't?
An authoritarian government can get someplace first. Right? There's no question about that. I'm not going to question that premise. But an idea is always more powerful, and so we have to be prepared for that eventuality. Let's start having those debates now. Let's not wait until that thing happens, and after it happens, wring our hands and be like, oh my God, what are we going to do? Right? Let's start having some of these debates now and say, hey, and base it on what is our value and why do we think this is important, because that is what is going to have a longer shelf life than any individual or any tactic that people are potentially using.
And I think the decision space for an authoritarian government, as Will said, is just super short, right? I mean, by the time the Chinese just decide we're going to invest in this new technology for our military, that decision space is about 3 years for the Pentagon. And right now, that doesn't mean it should stay 3 years, it should shorten, but it's 3 years.
And how long is the Chinese decision space?
Less than a year. From like, we have an idea, we want to invest in a new technology, we want to move, we want to go.
The chairman says do it, and do it.
Right, as opposed to us where we, and we have Congress has all kinds of rules, and they have to think about investments differently, and just there's a whole different structure to making decisions that makes them faster in pretty much every scenario. But the only way, it's not like they have augmented soldiers, so we have to get augmented soldiers. There is a way of saying that we're going to hold true to our values, but invest and double down in other things that help us compete in that fight. And I think that's what democracies aren't doing as well as we could, right? We're not like, we're saying, oh shoot, we don't want to compromise our values, so we're not going to do what this other government is doing. Well, no, then you need to find 5 other ways to kick their ass in different places. Yeah. And I think that's what I regret, is that there's some holding back and fear. And look, it's the same thing if you've got, if you're a politician and you're running against someone who just makes things up. The answer is not to just start making things up. The answer is to start beating them at different games and bring the battlefield back to reality.
And don't be afraid to use the power you do have, right? That is some of my concerns right now. Well, if we do this, this is going to escalate. They're going to escalate anyways. So if we're not using our soft power, if we're not using our hard power in a way to prevent, and back to first principle, prevent the massacre of innocent lives. We can do that. And so don't be afraid to use the tools and the power that you currently have.
Right. This is an interesting segue to a question about disinformation about America at home. And I think both of you think about these questions. You're a national security Republican, you're a national security Democrat. Your party obviously has a rather large crazy town faction. Adam Kinzinger was here to describe that a little while ago. Your party is not without people, obviously, who believe that America plays a malign role in the world. We've seen a lot of that discussion over the last couple of years. Talk about the Russian invasion of Ukraine in the context of how Americans understand themselves. And I ask this question for a very specific reason. It's very, very hard to convince the vast global audience that the American way of life is superior to the Russian Putinist way of life if Americans themselves don't believe it. And I'm wondering, it's a little bit of an RT question in a kind of way. Have we and our population suffered from disinformation about America's role in the world over the last 20 years?
Yes. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, but yes, we've suffered from it, right? Because many of us that care about these things or are involved in this have failed to articulate why these things matter. We have failed to articulate what should America's role in the rest of the world be. I'm of the opinion we should not have gotten out of Afghanistan. I had that debate here at the Institute of Politics a number of months ago, and because for the last 15 years, we have failed to articulate why it matters to people back home. I always say, why would my brother care about this stuff? And so it is connecting. Foreign policy is not foreign, and we have both. And again, the political spectrum is no longer a line; it's a horseshoe. The edges are closer to each other than they are to the middle. Both parties want to articulate to the extremist edges more than they are talking about the normal. What we've had to do over our careers is a lot harder than many of our lazy colleagues who just go in. My words, not hers.
They're mine too.
So we have to make that case, and we failed. Now, Ukraine is slightly different because the images that we're seeing, it's very clear to people that's wrong. They may not know what led to this, but what's happening there is wrong. So we have those images. Also, people that are worried about the price of gas at the pump or food, they recognize that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is impacting that. So people are starting to think, okay, some of these things are connected, but we have to make the case. When George Washington said, "Don't have intermingling alliances," whatever the word was used, my man George Washington was right at the time. But things are very different now. And the talking about how NATO, these debates about NATO back in 2016, about whether that was effective or not, many of the conversations of how things like NAFTA wasn't helpful and important to our society. We have to make the case why 70 years of peace and prosperity in Europe was good for us because it helped us increase our quality of life. It helped us uplift humanity. And if that erodes, our position in the world is going to erode, which means our retirement is going to be less. The ability for our kids and our grandkids to get access to good paying jobs is going to be impacted. We have to make that case every single time. It's hard, and it's hard to fit that into 208 characters.
I'm going to come to you. I just want to follow up with something about you and the party. My question for you is that wing of the party that is objectively pro-Putinist right now, are they victims of Russian disinformation, or do they just come to this all by themselves? And I'm talking about the people who kind of semi-drove you out of the party.
No, for sure. So there's only two options. They are witting or unwitting, right? And to be honest,
useful idiots or just useful non-idiots?
And because they think, so if you're witting, it's because you think there is a political expedience to doing that thing. Mm-hmm. If you're unwitting, it's because you're a moron. And so I don't know what's worse, if I'm being honest. How do you change
Tucker
that?
Carlson, moron or utilitarian player?
Look, if you're being quoted and being used, and clips are being used back in Moscow to make the case for Vladimir Putin, you're doing something wrong, and you need to rethink what you're doing.
Hear, hear. I would just say, just on Will's point, because I think it's interesting for people who are interested in public policy and journalism now, like coming up now, that we were both CIA officers. You're squirreled away. You're doing your thing. You're protecting the country. You're working on the issue that you've been assigned to work on, and you don't have to think about how the American public views your job. That's not your job to think about it. Then we both became members of Congress, which is the opposite, right? It's all, your bosses are the people who elect you. So it's all about what people think of you and think of what you're proposing. And the biggest lesson I've learned as a national security policy person who went into elected office is that it is no longer okay for a bunch of people of either party to just decide foreign policy and not bring the American public along with them. We're done with that era. Afghanistan and Iraq killed that era because the average person in my district knows exactly the price that we paid for Iraq and Afghanistan, if not in dollars, in the blood of the people who went into the military. So there is no longer that luxury of a bunch of people, Democrats and Republicans getting elected and sitting in Washington and deciding our role in the world. We need to have that conversation. I think that's what Will is getting at, is bringing people along. And we don't have a lot of great communicators on that. And it's true, after these 2 long wars and 20 years of all the blood and treasure spent, I don't blame the average college student who looks at the United States and says, why do we think we're so great, right? We don't necessarily, kick butt when we go abroad, and why do we have this such high and mighty approach? And I think what Russia is doing is reminding the average person that we are not perfect abroad, we are not always successful abroad, but man, we're better than that actor leading the world.
We're going to go to questions in 1 minute, but one last question from me for the two of you. If there's one thing that you could do to, while adhering to your values, counter Russian, Chinese disinformation globally, what would that be? A piece of legislation, a funding mechanism? What would the thing be? A technological fix?
I've been exposed to a company that is able to determine whether social media users are fake. Have that be pretty broadly exposed, right? So that you know clearly that this thing that you're working, that you're interacting with is fake on any of the systems. I think that would go a long way in changing the narrative.
I think disclosure is important, but I think there's just a higher level of digital literacy that we need in this country. And I know a lot of people who, even if they saw a label at the bottom, would still hit forward and send to people. And so to me, it is about education and just starting to figure out a way to educate from K through 12 on how to be more savvy digital users, because it's not going to stop. It's going to come from 100 different places, and even when people are going to be exposed to the originator of the stuff, they're still going to push it if they don't know what they're part of when they're doing that.
Yeah, right over there. Thank you. And please keep your questions short and in the form of a question. That'd be great.
My name is Kelsey, and I work for a tech startup called Logically that uses AI to identify disinformation online. And something I'm really curious about, based on the last question actually, is kind of the role that Congressman Hurd mentioned of kind of companies playing in this space, and then the role of education and of media literacy, civic literacy. And I'm also curious what your thoughts as legislators are on the now congressionally mandated Foreign Malign Influence Center, the creation of that center at ODNI. And is that an answer? And is that something that can bring together civil society, the domestic institutions, our foreign policy apparatus to kind of have a more holistic approach to countering malign influence?
I'll start with the last part first and then let Will do the private sector piece. So I am the chairwoman of the subcommittee on intelligence and counterterrorism on the Homeland Security Committee. And one of the things that we started looking at right after January 6th was domestic terrorism and how to deal with malign influence in our own country. And to say that it's a minefield is an understatement, right? Because of freedom of speech issues, because of people's concern on both the right and the left about the government dictating what they can look at and what they can read and what they can have access to. So that center was the best we could get to try and tackle this. And in a perfect world, it would be this open center where we could have that dialogue. But the minute you start having the government as a seat at the table, you start getting everybody like on their, their hackles go up. And so we've actually been able to do precious little to deal with the spread of disinformation and misinformation, even threatening activities and threatening speech online when the originator is an American and when they're influencing American viewers or American clickers or whatever. So that was as good as we could get, but still imperfect. And I think one of the things that the left and the right really unite around is that they don't want Washington deciding who's a good actor and who's a bad actor. And on the left, they'll say, like, look, right now, Democrats are in power, so I'm probably fine with whoever they'd go after, but I don't want it, if President Trump came back, I don't want them coming after black and brown people and, who are activists online. So it gets really complicated really fast. And I think actually outside of government is where we can do the most open thinking about this and then bring it as ideas to the government rather than having us be the lead actor in all of this.
I'll just add on the tech piece. Technology companies have to recognize that they have a public policy function as well, and they have a public policy responsibility. And so when you're developing these tools, you have to think about that your constituent is not just your investors or your customers, it's also the broader community that are being impacted by your tool.
There was a question right here.
Congresswoman Slotkin, you spoke about how China is really the long game for foreign policy. And Congressman Hurd, you've also passed legislation on AI. AI is commonly viewed as the current arms race. How competitive do you see our country being in that arms race? And what can we do to become the global leader in AI, given, I think as we've all learned, who controls these technologies does really matter in terms of how they end up being used?
I'll start, but I'm sure Will has something he wants to say on this. So I think that it comes down to the problem we were highlighting before of how different it is to be a democracy, trying to figure out how to incorporate that technology, and then if you're a dictatorship or the Communist Party and you can just make unilateral decisions. I think that while I would put money any day of the week on American entrepreneurs to come up with the tech behind all this innovation, I think the decision space in incorporating it especially in the government, is going to be slower than the startups. I mean, some of these startups would, as good patriotic Americans, would want to actually sell this to the government and have the government help, use it for good purposes. But there's a whole problem where the government cannot move fast enough and a startup dies on the vine before it can get that contract. I have no doubt that we can do the intellectual capital, but because it's so new, and because we're a democracy, there's going to be a slowness to incorporating it that's just a reality, unfortunately.
I just wrote a book about this topic, to be honest, and the whole point is, I thought I understood technology when I was in Congress. Being out a year working with some amazing technology companies, I realized how little I actually knew, and that these technologies are moving even faster. Best case scenario, we're tied with China. That's the best case scenario. And when Vladimir Putin, we've all heard this statement, whoever masters AI is going to master the world. When you have a country that doesn't care about civil liberties, you're always going to have more data. With more data, you're going to be able to train algorithms faster. Giving all that information to other authoritarian government is going to speed up this process. And this is why we can't look at this as the US alone. We have to be working with our allies, especially Europe, and we have to get beyond this transatlantic beef on what privacy is. Europe and America views privacy closer to each other than Europe and China does. And so my fear is, I've seen what American companies can do today. My fear is if the Chinese government has this, they're going to be able to get and why does this matter? Whoever has the first mover advantage of getting to close to artificial general intelligence. That first mover advantage is going to be so significant that you're never going to be able to catch up, and you don't want to be second place.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a question back there. I can't see that well, but okay, right here, and then maybe one more if we can. Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Evelina. I'm a graduate student at the Harris School of Public Policy. Congresswoman, you said that information is necessary to be able to spread, on-the-ground information is necessary to be able to spread awareness. I am from Armenia, and half of my family lives in Karabakh. Mm-hmm. When Azerbaijan attacked Karabakh in 2020, there were independent journalists on the ground, and the information was out there. But it seems like in the United States, there's a little bit of pick and choose as to whose humanity matters when we're amplifying their voices, whether it's in Congress or the tech platforms or just the average citizen. Does the US have a moral responsibility to amplify everyone's voice around the world, and whose voice really matters? Or is it more of a, how does it impact us? What's in it for us? And that's when we decide to amplify those voices.
Yeah, that's
you.
a great question. And I've had actually a version of this question asked not only by the Uyghur student who I met, but folks who are advocating on behalf of people in Yemen, right? There's all kinds of conflicts around the world that have been going on and are terrible and haven't gotten a fraction of the airtime that Ukraine has, right? I think it's a couple things. First of all, I do think we have a responsibility both in the executive branch and in Congress to highlight and flag these crises that are going on around the world. So whether it's Myanmar or Kashmir or places that aren't on the tip of the tongue of the average American, but are getting dealt with in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I do think we have a responsibility to highlight those. But it's kind of like, I hate to say this, it's kind of like the social media space and how one clip goes viral and one doesn't. It's like there's some sort of combination of things that take a conflict and make it a source of widespread interest. And I think for Ukraine, we can't overlook the fact that it's Russia. And anyone who's my age or older, like, it's a familiar enemy. It's a familiar bad guy, like Rocky IV. Like, it's, it is us versus them. And that feels more simple than our Nagorno-Karabakh, right? That for the average American, maybe their parents now and grandparents really understood this conflict, but they don't understand that conflict, and they don't understand Yemen. Also, we like good versus evil. right? We like when there's a bad guy and a good guy. And with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, it is hard to say, well, there are great people on both sides, right? Russia invaded under false pretenses.
Noting that it is still said, by the way.
Okay.
Yeah. Alas.
Fine, you're
Yeah.
right. So people
Yeah.
can, but the average American understands that there's sort of a good and an evil in this case. And I think when they don't understand a conflict, when it's hard to present in quick little sound bites, you don't grab that attention. It's not to say it's fair. And Lord knows the people in Yemen and other places do not feel like they're getting the attention that they deserve from the American public. But I think that's part of what makes one crisis amplify and others sit and fester.
I'll give Will the last word, but let me just follow that, because there's what's unspoken so far is that it's white.
Yeah.
That
too.
I mean, how much of that is just
That's
that these are white people and we're seeing white people suffer, and it just scans differently than what's going on in Ethiopia right now.
And many Ukrainians are more middle class, right? So they have the ability to put a TikTok video on with them and their dog and their like fleece jacket on top, and it looks like more of what many Americans associate with themselves. So I definitely think that that's part of it.
Part of the question is also, is there anything that the government can do to raise awareness of, you can't make people read things that they don't want to read, but is there something that you can do to bring attention to Yemen?
Yes, look, Congress has three powers. We have the power to appropriate money, we have the power to legislate, and the one that often is missed, the power to convene and amplify, right? Having a hearing, like I went to the hearing, I'm not on the Foreign Affairs Committee, but I went to the hearing on Kashmir because I have such a large Pakistani American population in my district that was really focused on this issue. Having a hearing and amplifying that and then getting the press there, that's part of what we can do. But I can't make, my cousin in Michigan like start spreading that all over her TikTok because it's not grabbing her. And I think that's just a reality. It's unfair. It's deeply unfair, but it is a reality.
Last word to you.
Since the 40s, we've been saying never again. But shit happens all the time. And there was things that have been within our power to prevent. And America has become an exceptional nation, not because of what we have taken, but because of what we have given. And we have to make the cases, even when it's unpopular, even when people don't understand it, of why that matters to us and our way of life and how this ultimately impacts us. And when we do that, when America's operating that way, we're at our best. And we have to get beyond this notion about only caring about ourselves because the world is interconnected and it's our responsibility. Some people have the ability to carry heavier loads than others. That's why JFK said we were the standard bearers and the watchmen to the walls of world freedom. And that's our responsibility. We can't shy away from it.
Will Hurd, Elissa Slotkin, thank you very, very much. Thank you, everyone.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage our final panel. Imagining a Better Social Media, with Ethan Zuckerman from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, Cecilia Kang, author of An Ugly Truth, Inside Facebook's Battle for Domination, Frances Haugen, advocate for accountability and transparency in social media, Aaron Simpson, Director of Technology Policy at Center for American Progress, and moderated by Charlie Warzel, contributing writer at The Atlantic and author of the newsletter Galaxy Brain.
Hello. Thank you. So this is the one where we solve it. And we have 35 minutes, so we should get it done pretty quickly. We've done a lot, we've heard a lot about analyzing the problem. We've also heard some solutions, but we have here before us a group of people who have dedicated so much time to thinking in a future-forward way, in a productive way about all these problems. And I wanted to start with Cecilia to sort of give the state of play here in terms of Washington, D.C., but also your reporting, your extensive book-length reporting inside Facebook. You have this understanding of what's happening inside these organizations, but also what's happening on Capitol Hill. Just sort of walk us through, what you see as when we are trying to imagine a better social media. Like, what are the guardrails in which that conversation is being had at the moment?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Charlie, for convening this this panel. So I think it's helpful to sort of zoom out a little bit and look at history as a guide to sort of level set expectations, because I think that anybody who looks at Washington right now, and even after listening to, for example, Senator Klobuchar talk about the struggle to get she mentioned one bill that she proposed in 2018. It is still sort of like introduced every session and has not passed. Things don't seem like they're moving. But I might be a little bit, I dare to say, a little optimistic. If we look at history, we might actually get a better sense of level set expectations. It's going to take a long time, but the solutions are going to have to be from the regulatory perspective, as well as from the consumer perspective, as well as from the companies. I'm least sort of optimistic about that last piece. But I want to talk about, and I think illustrative is to look at actually a hearing that Frances was the witness of last fall, where several members of the Senate panel described that moment with a whistleblower from within Facebook revealing so many problems from within based on documents, et cetera, that so many lawmakers said, this is the big tobacco moment. This is the moment, right? I think I counted more than 5 lawmakers described it as that. Not a bad example. Facebook hates when they're compared to tobacco because fairly, it's a different product. But it is a good sort of analogy in the sense that it took 50 years from the first medical reports that showed that tobacco was harmful to our health to a whistleblower in the 80s that came out from within the tobacco industry that showed that there was documented problems from within the tobacco industry, to state lawsuits, to federal regulation, to where we are today. And it took consumer behavior to change. So those appear to me to be all the components that need to be in place and that we have to think about when you think about change and solutions. We will drill into some of the regulatory aspects of it, but on the regulatory front, it's not going to be one thing. It's not going to be break up the companies alone, and if you agree or don't disagree with that. It's not going to be just privacy. It has to be sort of many things. And the good news, again, and I promise again, I will be optimistic, is that the conversation is getting smarter. I've been covering this for a long, long time, and sometimes I just go to these hearings, and I remember the earliest ones with Mark Zuckerberg in 2018, I was just like, oh my God, what a distraction, some of these questions. But I think Congress is getting smarter. I'm not saying they're smart. They're getting smarter, on what the issues are, what the technologies are. And one of the most promising things that I've seen is the conversation move away from let's regulate types of speech that are on platforms and more towards let's look at the system. Let's look at the design of the technologies and let's think about if there are ways to regulate how things get amplified very quickly, whether companies should disclose when things go viral and how they go viral and give consumers control of that. So there's a lot to talk about today, but I think that generally, I'm going to be the optimist maybe on this panel. Maybe there are others.
Well,
It'll take time.
And I think it's a good frame for this because there are ways in which you can take the headline of this panel, imagining a better social media. Like I reject the part of that looks for easy solutions, but also like going so future forward here because like in my writing and reporting, I think about this as like a printing press level, multi-generational problem and, coinciding with rise of inequality, rise of the far right, all sorts of different things. And we look at it and we say, okay, so what tweak can we make to the code to fix the world? And that is just a really difficult place to be. It's a way to set yourself up for failure. Aaron, you think about this all the time, and also from the framework of like what role, should the government be playing in here? What can it do? What can it do? But also in the way of how do we think about? I think you said to me backstage, sort of imagining a less bad social media instead of a perfect social media. But can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to end up echoing some of this optimism and this cautious optimism. So at first, getting to a better social media is just going to look like getting to a marginally less bad social media. But I'm here to say that is worth doing. That is worth doing. These are the technologies that are interoperating so many of our social relationships in our world and how we understand each other. And so we've heard throughout this whole conference that there's just not the silver bullet for this thicket of cultural issues, political issues, technical issues that are at play in this conversation. But rebuilding our information ecosystem in the long term to protect civic values, to protect public interest values, starts with actual steps that we can take right now, that we are talking about to address different parts of the problem. We heard about some of them this morning, right? The tech antitrust bills, passing robust federal privacy, incentivizing greater interoperability, requiring greater transparency, making our consumer protection organizations more robust. We can do this. And particularly, we can start this kind of small progress soon, right? The tech antitrust bills are close. And I really encourage you, if you care about disinformation, even if you're sort of new to competition issues, take a look, because we're just not getting out of this with sort of the monoculture of social media we have right now. We're going to need competition. We're going to need better rules to enable whatever better social media looks like to grow. And I'm happy to talk sort of more about what I hope that looks like, but I imagine we'll get into it quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely, we will. And what I love about that sort of framework is it's something I notice in reporting all the time, which is that the quote unquote boring stuff, the least sexy stuff, is the stuff. It's always the most interesting stuff. It's always the most impactful stuff. But a lot of reason when we're talking about the conversation getting sophisticated, a big part of that is one of our panelists here coming before with not only a remarkable trove of information to share, but also I think the way that you framed this conversation around design is incredibly important for just changing the way we think about this. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about how what the next step is and what you are what you are advocating for now, because one of my fears too about this whole conversation is that it gets stuck, it gets saturated. We all know what the problems are, and then we start to kind of tune out. But we were talking about a sort of a product safety angle earlier back. Tell me what's on your mind right now.
So the big thing that I've been talking about since the first Senate hearing was about a framing of, we've been talking a lot about censorship for a very, very good reason, which is Facebook knew that no one could see behind the curtain, like no one could see what's actually happening. And so we had to rely on them for framing what should we talk about. And they knew we would never agree on censorship. Like you look at the oversight board does not have oversight over Facebook as a whole. They only have oversight over specific judgments on should this piece of content have been taken down or left up. The thing I've been repeating since the beginning was we need to be thinking about linguistic equity, right? Because linguistic equity and product safety go hand in hand. Instead of focusing on censorship systems where we have to rewrite them over and over and over again, right? I just came from testifying in Berlin, which is why I'm yawning, and I'm so sorry. Like I flew in yesterday. I pointed out there's 27 countries in Europe. Like I went to Norway, there's 5 million Norwegian speakers. They don't have safety systems. they might have a handful of moderators. I guarantee you the Ukrainian moderators, there's very few of them because so few people speak Ukrainian. The reason I brought these documents forward is Facebook knows lots and lots of ways to make these products safer that don't involve content. And when they don't involve content, we can do them in every language in the world. It's about questions like, if Alice writes something and Bob reshares it and Carol reshares it, so now we're beyond friends of friends. If Dan has to make a choice, if there has to be intention, if there has to be a human in the loop to spread that content further, not just an instinct like a click, that has the same impact on misinformation as the entire third-party fact-checking system. I never want to hear Mark Zuckerberg again talk about how he's learned that sometimes you have to be unpopular to stand up for something you value, and he's a defender of freedom of speech. Why don't we cut the reshare chains at 2? Then we're not judging which ideas are good or bad. I think there's a really big opportunity in the next year to start setting norms on, hey, we knew all these things you could be doing to work on virality, to be working on what the levers are that are causing the misinfo. What is the floor for negligence? What about for kids? What's the floor for keeping under 13s off the platform? Because right now, Facebook's bragging about keeping 600,000 kids off the platform in the last year. But they have documents that say that 20% of 11-year-olds were on Facebook for some cohorts. That number's probably even higher for Instagram. So if we can begin establishing those standards around what does minimal product safety look like, there's a number of large class action lawsuits that are coming through right now that want to say, hey, you're responsible for the consequences of not being anywhere near the floor. And I think things like our consumer protection groups can also use those standards.
Well, I want to, there was when Senator Klobuchar was talking earlier, answering the question of how do you measure quality? I feel like we get into these, right? We talk about the norms. Norms take time. They take buy-in from people. But I felt that the answer to how do you measure quality is very vague because it's a very difficult question to answer. But when you say these norms, what are you thinking of? Just
Sure. Norms fall in a lot of dimensions. Some of them are organizational, right? One of the things that a document in the disclosures calls for is do you have the people who set what content can be on your system? Are they in the same reporting chain as the people whose job is to keep governmental officials happy? That's a choice, right? That's a characteristic of some orgs and not of others. Twitter keeps those chains apart because they naturally are in conflict. Politicians are going to say, hey, you took my content down. And then that conflict gets resolved somewhere other than the CEO. That's a kind of choice, and it has real consequences on the safety of the system. Other things are like transparency. I think part of the reason why Twitter requires you to click on a link before you reshare it, I don't think anyone was censored by being required to click on a link. That choice causes 10 or 15% less misinformation, just because people have to choose to spread the information. I think Twitter does that because they also share 10% of all the tweets with anyone who asks. They know they're being watched. We can ask that as a characteristic of organizations. What transparency are you doing? Are you allowing other people to make judgment calls about you? And so I think that these are the kinds of norms where we can start to have conversations on at least what the 1.0 version of the norms are. And we can keep getting more sophisticated as we get more data, as we have more conversations. But I think very rapidly, if we even did a first draft, we would see there's actually pretty big differences between the social media companies that we see today.
Ethan, you are looking into the orb and look towards the future in a sort of a different way, in a way that is asking us to actually imagine something different and something better. The idea, I've referred to the platforms as failed states a lot of times. So how can we move forward on that? And you have been doing a lot of work on digital public infrastructure based around civic values, not maximizing profits. Can you tell us a little bit about that vision?
So let's go back a little bit before we go forward.
Great.
So Professor Stone said something really extraordinary yesterday. He said that he sees social media as the greatest threat to democracy in the world today, which is saying something when you literally have an army rolling through Ukraine.
Sure.
We are 11 years past the Arab Spring, a moment at which we watched people literally overthrow dictators using social media. We've changed our opinion rather radically in the last decade or so. And for some good reasons, right? 2016, we saw the power of myths and disinformation, not just in the election in this country, with Brexit. We have woken up, and now we have a sense for what the stakes are. And you have extraordinary people taking extraordinary risks to make sure that we know about these situations. We have amazing leaders like Senator Klobuchar going out and trying to give us a legislative structure. But almost everything we've talked about for 3 days here is about making Facebook less awful. I don't want to just make Facebook less awful. I actually want to build social media that is good for us as individuals, good for us as citizens, good for us as neighbors. We can do that, but you got to start from a different place. Nothing we've talked about, none of these networks like YouTube or Facebook were designed to be healthy spaces for us to have conversations with one another. Facebook was designed to make people keep clicking on it so it could serve as many ads as possible and suck out as much personal data as possible so it could target those ads better. We can engineer spaces that try to make it possible for people to have civil conversations with one another. We can engineer spaces to help people find their friends and neighbors and talk about local issues. We can build spaces that try to increase the diversity and reduce the homophily of conversations. We're not doing that. We are, at best, looking at these systems and saying, how do we make them less awful? We have shifted media systems before. If you go back to the 1960s, TV sucked. It was basically
Vast wasteland, right?
a whole bunch, you've already stolen my line, it was a whole bunch of rigged quiz shows, lightweight sitcoms. Newt Minow takes a look at this in 1961 and says it's a vast wasteland. Minow doesn't respond by shutting down the television networks. He responds by starting in motion the funding of PBS and NPR.
Right.
So the key here is not to take I Love Lucy off the air, it's to figure out how we build Sesame Street alongside it.
Can I ask to this, and this isn't exactly what you're talking about, but I think examples of smaller community-based social networks obviously exist. I look at the various places I've lived since Nextdoor started, and I've watched these things devolve. I've also watched WhatsApp groups, of people devolve during COVID into just true horror shows. I'm curious how you think about building these communities and these structures and the way that the design can actually lead to that healthy thing, because it's not just about the scale or the fact that this many people are on it. Scale is super important, but you can still mess it up.
There's at least 3 things you have to do differently, right? The first is exactly as you said, scale. Human beings don't live in communities of 3 billion people. There is no such thing as a community of 3 billion people. There are human communities of between 30 and 3,000 people. And we need to be thinking about building social networks that work on those scales. Those social networks need to be moderated. We moderate each other in spaces. You are moderating this conversation. We moderate ourselves in all sorts of different spaces. And moderation can't be a cost center. It can't be something where we hand it over to poorly paid people in the Philippines to flip through 3-ring binders and decide whether speech is there or not. That needs to be governance. If you rethink how social networks work so that the people who are participating in them are governing the spaces, they're deciding what speech is acceptable, they're deciding how to moderate it, you actually end up strengthening democracy. You're giving people that opportunity to be involved in a society and involved with the rulemaking process. The trick is we have only done this a very small number of times. You can look at small examples like Front Porch Forum in Vermont, which actually shows a way of doing Nextdoor that isn't toxic and isn't healthy. But we are not investing in this. And the radical thing I'm going to say, and particularly at University of Chicago, I think we should tax the crap out of surveillance advertising companies. I think we should create massive public funding to do 2 things. One is to audit these existing networks and make sure that they work the way that we want them to. And the second is to fund a wave of experimentation in building social networks that we govern, we control, that are non-commercial, that are non-surveillance, and actually work to benefit us as individuals and citizens.
So when I think about that, I think about the fact that one way to get people to participate and involve in that is also at the same time to, make the big flashy platforms like better, right? Because these things have to work in tandem. I don't think people are just going to jump, especially when you have that scale and saturation. When it all sort of makes me think about getting down to brass tacks on it. Well, do you have something to say?
But it's a question of push and pull.
Sure.
Right. That right now, people don't actually get to see what they're consuming. Right. Like people are not aware of like, for example, all the content on Facebook can be largely divided into two pools: content you asked for and content you did not ask for. Right. So content you asked for is like you asked to see content from your friends, your family, groups you actually joined, pages you actually followed. And then there's things like if one of your friends commented on some other post and Facebook decided to put it in your feed, or someone invited you to a group, you didn't even accept it, but Facebook put that content in your feed for 30 days and you happen to click on something and now you're in that group. Like Facebook knows right now that when they give you more content you actually asked for free, you get less hate speech, less misinformation, less nudity. But you don't get to make that choice because you don't know what's even happening to you. And so it's wonderful to have alternatives, but if people don't get a chance to see what the choice is, they're not going to make the choice.
Right. Well, and I think one way to look at this that we don't talk about enough broadly is that we give the algorithm this wizardry power, right? This thing is it's pushing us everywhere. We have no control over it, and also to be almost more defensive about the fact these things are actually kind of dumb in the sense that they think that our preferences are what we click on. They don't take us as three-dimensional human beings with hopes and wants and needs and dignity into play. It's literally I liked it, and so I think that part of the conversation. Aaron, do you think that the conversation is sophisticated enough right now in order for us to sort of reimagine the things that you would like to see done?
Yes. I also call those things auto magic, where they want you to think that it's not, there's people behind the curtain carefully calibrating and coding what's going on, right? We have this sort of poverty of language when it comes to talking about digital products, especially consumer tech. So much of this conversation has been just the parameters defined by the industry, the vocabulary we use. We're just catching up socially, culturally with how we want to think about these things and how we want to make different political choices with how we're referring to sort of what's going on. And I think the conversation is getting a lot more sophisticated, right? We have, sort of woken up. We've had a whole conference about this problem. And we're starting to ask for these alternatives, right? And one of the really promising things about alternatives is imagining alternatives to, go to the name of the panel. But this is what's been a little bit hard about the tech antitrust fight, is helping people think about they're actually your Prime's going to be fine. But also, e-commerce doesn't have to just look like Amazon. Search doesn't have to just look like Google. We have a bit of a lack of imagination when it comes to what consumer tech would be because these markets have been so stagnant and so bogged down. And so when we get to greater competition, when we put a floor down on let's stop a surveillance, extractive, non-consensual business model, and laws can do that, right? We can just say we actually don't want that. It's bad for people, it's bad for democracy. The business model innovation, the product innovation, we want pluralism in our information infrastructure. In the same way we talk about pluralism sort of with media as an important part of democratic society, pluralism with our information infrastructure. The information ecosystem we have online, there's a lot of exciting things that we could do, and I think we're just starting to reach for those, right?
And I think one of the reasons when we're at the reality level of this, one of the reasons for this lack of imagination is the fact that these decisions are being made by a handful of people. Cecilia, you report inside these companies, you talk to these people, and I think an issue that has come up in your work is the lack of diversity in this space in every possible way. We're talking geographic, we're talking of geopolitical, everything. A lot of white men making those decisions in those rooms. But what do you see and how do you think about that as part of this poverty of imagination?
Yeah, I think it's so important. I think it's so important to, and you cannot underestimate how the lack of diversity at the very top within the boards and the concentration of power in leadership at these companies have these downwind effects, 100%. So it's really extraordinary that there is, and it's actually unusual at this point, that Mark Zuckerberg is still in charge as a founder CEO 16 years later of a company. It's not $1 trillion anymore, but it's like more like $700 billion, but still a lot of money, worth that much on the markets. And he still has, at the very end of the day, the last say on the big decisions. We're seeing right now Twitter, there's an interesting individual, richest man in the world, who just bought a big stake too. There's so much stake. And the thing that I found in my reporting is that there is actual, like, a through line between some of these decisions that happen and the consequences that have on users, especially global users, who are in places where some of these leaders have never even thought about, nor have traveled to, nor have had lived experiences in. These are people, individuals who are in charge of companies, white men, often surrounded by people who have the same sort of pedigree as they do, and they've not lived life. And we're seeing them kind of come up with their own philosophies on the fly. I mean, we've seen that, and we wrote about this in our book, as well as many people here and so many other reporters. We've seen Mark Zuckerberg is a great example, go from not having to think about policy to giving a big speech at Georgetown and then realizing, oh, maybe I wasn't so right about politicians, and maybe I wasn't so right about, so maybe I'll create a Facebook oversight board, and maybe I'll do all these. These are all these sort of like twists and turns that he's making that's very tied to his personal development. So I think diversity is incredibly important, especially if you're a global platform. You're not going to have the number of people who speak the many different Burmese languages, and that are commensurate with the number of users you have there, unless you prioritize it, unless it's part of your lived experience. And I think that's so critical, and we're seeing the consequences of that. Name your country. We can point to India, we can point to Ethiopia, we can point to South America. Like, it's just so critical. So when I think that cannot be regulated, but it's a norm. Maybe that's a norm that you're talking about. That I think is, you cannot underestimate that. So when I see more, frankly, and I'm sorry there's so many white guys here, but so I see so many rich white guys who continue to continue to sort of strengthen their power around these important platforms for speech. I wonder, where are their inputs,
I'd love to build on that if I can.
Yeah.
One of my favorite examples out there of a successful alternative social network is built by a group called Assembly 4. Assembly 4 is a collective of sex workers in Australia who were deplatformed from Twitter and Backpage by Zesta Fosta. So well-meaning, but ultimately incredibly damaging legislation that made it really dangerous for people who were engaging in sex work to be on commercial platforms. These women started building their own alternatives on servers. They won't say where they are for fear of getting them shut down. They ended up building the largest alternative to Twitter out there. It was called Switter.at. They had to shut it down about 2 weeks ago, thanks to the Australian government. They built something called Trist, which is an alternative to Backpage, which continues to be widely used. One of the extraordinary things is that most of the innovation that we're seeing in the space right now is from people for whom existing commercial tools do not work. We are seeing groups that have been deplatformed, that have been chased off of other services, building their own networks because they have to. You look at Archive of One's Own. This is the leading archive of fan fiction. So these are people writing extensions to copyrighted works. They have a women-run, women-governed social network that they programmed entirely themselves that serves 5 million people a year. These are extraordinary experiments, but they're being done by people who could not find places on these existing networks. What could we do if we actually looked at this and said, what would it mean to be building a network that is owned by people in the global south, that is owned by people who are not well served by existing networks? We've had almost no experimentation in that space.
Francis?
And we have to have that conversation, right? Like I think a thing that is I try to always repeat in every public appearance I make is there's like 1 billion users or more on Facebook. It might be as high as 2 billion. The internet is Facebook, right? Yeah. For probably a majority of languages in the world, 80 or 90% of all the content on the internet in their language is only on Facebook.
That's right.
And yet Facebook's business model cannot extend safety to them. Because just like Amy Klobuchar said earlier today, they made $55 per person in the United States. They made about 14.5 in Europe per person. They made 4.5, in Asia, and they made 2.5 in the rest of the world. And so the places that are the most linguistically diverse, the business model currently cannot offer them safety. And so remember, and they don't get to choose to go anywhere else because the internet, Facebook bought the right to be their internet.
I have a question. Well, actually, I'll let you respond.
Yes, I'll respond briefly, which is just, I think scale, we can all sort of sympathize, right? Like, oh, billions of pieces of content a day, so much, the scale is a lot. But they have built the infrastructure to sort of profit off of all of your clicks, right? Like they are watching people in every language, in every place, doing what they're doing. So there's a little bit of an asymmetry here in the infrastructure we've built to keep people safe and the infrastructure we've built to turn a really robust profit. And so it's a little bit of a David and Goliath argument here when it does come to scale. And it's important to think about, like, we think about digital platforms as having really low marginal costs, which often they do. Like software is really fungible, that's great. But those costs are high and they are externalized, right? Like they're externalized onto people when you don't build the reporting infrastructure to think about harassment. They're externalized to democracy when you don't have Spanish language labels for your election policies. And so part of this is thinking about where are the costs, where are the profit centers, and how are we maybe internalizing some of those costs as well.
So we have to get to the Q&As in a second. So I'm going to kind of parrot a question that Kara asked, because what are we all doing if not copying Kara a little bit, right? And if you were, emperor for the day or had your magic wand to wave in any part of this imagining a better social media, and one thing we're not going to probably get to is like the idea of like how do you actually force Mark Zuckerberg into accountability? Like, and I'm talking like true accountability.
Yeah.
How do you actually do it?
No.
But so it can go from there, or it can be to like this is the platform I would build and seed with, like 10,000 wonderful human beings to get going. But what's the thing you would do right now? And I'll just go down the line. So, Cecilia.
So again, I'm a journalist, so I don't have an opinion, but I have an observation from my reporting.
There it is.
So, lowest bar, lowest hanging fruit, or whatever the idiom is. It's transparency. I think that there's regulation and transparency. It's like so fascinating the papers that you revealed were really fascinating this way to show how the systems work. And I think that transparency and how things go viral, how things are ranked. A quick anecdote, during I wrote a little bit about the back and forth between Facebook and the White House over COVID misinformation. And a lot of it, the struggle was basically just on the company not wanting to turn over data and they're saying this is a privacy issue, but it's all anonymized. It was just like not giving the denominator of like how big the problem of misinformation is, turning over that information, compelling the companies through regulation perhaps to show how ranking systems works when things go viral to researchers maybe to begin with. Government is trickier sometimes when it comes to handing over data. But it sounds sort of mundane, but I think lowest hanging fruit, that's a good place because let's be honest, before we go to big solutions, we still are figuring things out and understand or educating how the systems work, the technologies work. And I think, yes, solutions are good to go to, and there's some obvious ones out there legislatively and with regulation, but let's not kid ourselves and be a little bit humble and to understand we need to actually get the companies to reveal more so that we can understand them more.
Every healthy conversation needs a moderator, and we need Q&As to go. So everyone's going to be quick.
Yes, sorry.
So I already gave you the notion of taxing surveillance advertising and funding from there. I'll throw one other out. We don't really have public broadcasting in this country. We have voluntary broadcasting. It has very little government subsidy. It's mostly money raised by the audiences. Europe really does have public broadcasting, and they invest significant amounts of money in it. They should be building communities like the ones that I'm talking about, that people govern and people use for civic conversations, the good news is they're talking about it. We're not generally hearing those conversations, but there's amazing work being done by groups like Public Spaces in the Netherlands. We should pay more attention to what's going on there.
I want to re-amplify the message for transparency and the idea that we need more people at the table. Like I usually try to stay away from saying like, you should do the following 30 things. Like there's easily 30, 50 things in that you can pull out of the documents that are just obvious things you should do. But I try to stay away from that because we got here because not enough people sat at the table. And so we need transparency and we need to fundamentally change how we educate on these things. Because right now we lack even the basic lab bench to teach classes on these kinds of product safety changes. And because you can't have an intern on your congressional staff, no one is sitting there pushing people, being like, hey, there's an alternative other than censorship.
Well, in a dream world, as much as I would love to fund, 1,000 indie social media and journalism startups that reflect the communities they serve, I'm not in a dream world, but we are in the real world, Charlie, and we can actually support like tech antitrust legislation that we could get done by the end of the year. That would be a part of this problem that's worth doing.
We are in the real world. We know it every day. Questions for our fine humans here? We'll go in the front, I guess.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I'm Alec Fizoso. I'm a first year at the college, and my question revolves around, towards the start of the conversation, you guys did a great job talking about how we can prevent like the rapid spread, like the conscious decision, like a pop-up window will show up before you actually send out, some controversial or content with, filled with disinformation. But my question revolves around the first send or the source of the information. How can we meet people where they're at that are actually providing the primary source of this disinformation, and like whether it be like our parents or family members or people in our community that are the reason it's being like put on these platforms in the first place?
I think it's hugely important for us to differentiate between are we talking about a problem of bad content and bad people, or are we talking about a problem of amplification networks, and particularly inauthentic amplification networks? So when your uncle, your mom, whatever, sends something that is misinformation, very, very often, those are not random messages. Like Facebook does a very, very, very bad job at taking down networks. Like they have the technology to find the networks. They underinvest in the actual people that come in and say, actually, that is a network, and we'll take it down. Or like a shockingly high fraction of influence operations on Facebook are caught with Twitter's data, right? And that they find those networks and then they mirror them on Facebook. And so the source of a lot of these problems are there's 10,000 plus people, maybe hundreds of thousands of people in adversarial nations that are actively trolling through the content and figuring out what to spread out. And I think that's a much, much bigger part of the problem.
Yeah, please.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. My name's Van. I'm a fourth year, and I'm in Tech Team, a group that Aaron co-founded. At the IOP.
Cool.
We've talked a lot about regulating Facebook here. We've talked about, how there are language disparities and fact-checking. And Facebook is an American company, so in some ways we have a unique way to be able to regulate them, but these are all different countries and they all use Facebook differently. For instance, I think in Myanmar, like 100% of people use Facebook and it's like the main communication. And so like if we regulate it here, like that might have like large impacts in other countries. And like, so I guess my main question is, to what extent like do we have, can we like regulate how Facebook acts because that makes just such large impacts in other countries? Do we have the right to be able to make these large regulations when we're essentially impacting other people who aren't being represented in that sort of regulation?
I'll start. Hello. Thank you for volunteering with Tech Team to help the nonprofits around. It's so cool to be back at the University of Chicago. That got me my start. And so grateful for a University of Chicago education and an Institute of Politics education. Loving this full circle moment. I think picking up on the thread of humility when it comes to these kinds of things. So as the American Congress, we both we're legislating from a very particular, a partial point of view. And we need to recognize that what we do will have really huge ramifications. and then think those through, but also know that the real power sharing is going to come from us understanding how we can work with other nations, other democratic nations, to be thinking about human rights, civil rights, protecting those. And the more that we can do transatlantic work, and work not just with Europe, but like with the whole world, to uplift people who are also trying to make a better social media, then that's what we should be doing, because we do have sort of a unique place, given that they're American companies.
There's a really complicated dynamic that comes to platforms like Facebook, particularly in closed societies. There are real verifiable examples of how Facebook had enormous positive effect. You can very much trace the fall of the Ben Ali government in Tunisia to videos that are spread on Facebook, that are amplified over Al Jazeera. That is a real story. So trying to figure out how you shut Facebook out of societies where it can be used in really dangerous ways has double edges to it. At the same time, there's places where we know that companies do not understand how these tools are being used and the impacts they're having. Once it became clear the effects of Facebook in Myanmar, you had organizations on the ground say, hey, Facebook, you keep talking about how you have local advisors. We think we are your local advisors. We can't get you on the telephone. And if we are your backup, you are failing. So there have to be ways that we look at platforms and say, if 100% of Burmese who are online are on via Facebook, if 95% of Nigerians who are online via Facebook, there need to be real presences in those countries of local hires who understand the political situation and understand danger associated with speech. The problem, as Francis explained, is those companies are not making money in those countries, and they cannot and will not afford that. This is a system that economically does not work very well, and we have to start looking for alternatives to it.
And they chose to make it that way. They chose to go into those markets because they were afraid of, say, TikTok emerging out of those places, that if they didn't play there, something else would grow up there and disrupt them. And so, like, we need to say, hey, Facebook, Twitter did not do this. Like, they stayed out of a lot of countries. You made a choice to do this, and you should be responsible.
I want to ask a perhaps dumb question on that, which is how do you mandate anything like this? I really feel that at the end of the day, the big struggle is how do you push towards this? And obviously, there's ways to leverage the pressure, but I mean, how do you mandate that? That's a corporate restructuring question.
I think it's a question on liability. Right, like right now, they're the very first class action lawsuits about some of these tragedies, and I think part of the problem is that we have accepted Facebook's frame of reference for so long that the only thing to discuss was censorship, and we're not talking about that question I said before about the content you asked for that you consented to and the content you did not consent to, right? They should be responsible for those choices, and so I'm hoping that conversation opens up more broadly in the future.
Do we have others? Sir, over there. Oh, I don't know. Do you have whoever's closest to your microphone, truly? Oh.
Hey, friends.
Hi.
Hi, Joan.
Hi. So Joan Donovan, Harvard Kennedy School, Shorenstein Center. Check out our SoundCloud. No, I'm just razzing at Charlie. Sorry. So I'm really wondered. I'm having a problem with 2022. I mean, what we usually see during the midterms is a lot of rapid fire testing of different tactics and procedures of disinformers. The shift from 2016 to 2020 was remarkable in the sense that you had real politicians and their allies willing to burn their accounts for this big lie. What do you anticipate is coming? And if you could come up with one intervention in the short term that everyone in this room could write op-eds about and maybe create some kind of peer pressure before 2022, how could we do that? Simple question, solutions panel, happy to be here.
So one of the things that people always come back to on the freedom of speech question is there was like the solution to bad speech is good speech. And part of the problem is that narrowcast misinformation started being a huge issue in 2020. Like, part of why my team got formed was they caught Russians targeting misinformation at police officers. I think Facebook has the ability currently to segment the US population in like a privacy conscious way. Like, they don't say this group is X, it's just there's a number on it. Facebook should have to publish what the most popular 1,000 posts are every week in each of those 600 segments in the United States. Because right now there's literally no opportunity to counter misinformation. That misinformation that is targeted at a specific community may not raise to the level that third-party fact checkers are willing to fact check it. And it's definitely invisible to people that are outside of that segment. And so I believe if we wish to have a democracy, we have to see what those targeted information streams are, because we're living in divergent realities. And we can't even go in there and pay for ads to counter that speech if we don't know the speech is taking place.
I'm going to add darkness to something that we otherwise might feel good about. I'm watching President Zelensky use social media in a way that I think is incredible and in some ways unprecedented. And it's basically turning the camera on yourself and using the selfie as a form of authenticity. And you've seen this. You've seen this in press conferences. He starts at the window and shows Kyiv, and then he walks to his desk, and then it cuts to a normal press conference. It's this sense of, I am here just the same way that you are out in the world. You are listening to me, a human being experiencing this terrible situation. I expect that to be exploited to an incredible degree by the disinformation community in the near future. I am glad that someone, for the right reasons, is using this technique. It works incredibly well for us. We are wired to pay attention to what feels like that authentic personal voice, and I expect it to be abused if it is not already being abused.
I feel like that's already also happening too with lots of, lots of live streaming stuff. I mean, it's just like that technique I see in those types, far right kind of spaces.
I haven't seen it weaponized to be the mainstream. So far, there's the weaponization of sort of false authority, right? We've had a theme throughout this of medical mis and disinformation. I think that's actually been extremely powerful in terms of saying, here's who I am, here's what my status, I'm going to build on this. I expect it to be more about presence, authenticity, the camera facing yourself to be the main tool for it.
Aaron, you had.
Yes, taking the point that imagining better social media actually is a long-term thing, and that harm reduction now is going to be really important heading into 2022. It's a little bit of a ballgame after 2020, what we're going to be seeing, especially with Ukraine and everything else that's gone down in the pandemic. A couple of things, I'll double down on greater transparency. I think equity among languages, if they're adding context or friction, we need those in all languages that are spoken on the platform in the United States with moderators in the United States aware of the cultural context. And then amplification checks, right? Like, if it's being paid for or if you're making money off of amplifying it, like, once things start picking up, like, we need them to be getting in there sooner. Like, we don't want another plandemic, but for the 2022 elections.
I would say one other really tactical thing is we deserve to have, like, just how Twitter has like 1/10 of all the tweets, like Facebook could be putting out streams of accounts that are acting in coordination. Like, they clearly are not willing to staff enough people to vet these things. Like, having a public stream where you say these people all have high reach and they're coordinated sets of accounts, we should look at them. That would allow independent researchers to at least chip in.
Cecilia, how do you think about covering this too?
Oh, covering it. Well,
or whatever you were going to say.
No, I'll go to the covering it question. So this is the whole focus of technology reporting. It's not about gadgets and, cool new product releases and upgrades. It's about accountability is what we call it, and through the lens of these being the most powerful entities really right now in our society, both financially as well as political clout, et cetera. So it's a huge priority. As far as the election goes, again, this is another example of where these are voluntary measures taken by the company. So you're probably going to see, companies take different tacks. It's usually Twitter's first, and then the other companies follow, and they're a little bit more willing to be experimental. But they have said they're willing to put more resources, obviously, into it, bigger security staff. We'll see. But I do think that you can't underestimate friction, as Aaron said. just like that one example, that pop-up that says, you didn't read this story, you sure you want to retweet it? Like that's big, you know? And friction and transparency, and again, these sound kind of mundane, but for us to see why things go viral, to understand, for example, in the days after 2020, nobody knew this until this was reported by the New York Times and others, that Facebook changed the ranking systems behind the newsfeed to prioritize, they call it the nicer newsfeed, to prioritize more authoritative news sources than more fringe and polarizing news sources. And that had an effect. It actually slowed the spread of misinformation around the election. To know that many months later was interesting. It would be good to have the ability to understand that either real time or even after, and not being reported out just because reporters were really good at digging out that information, but to have that voluntarily released or compelled in some way, that kind of information.
Yeah, it's also going to be a scary, tumultuous time, I imagine. We're about at time. I want to thank everyone here. Unless you have a closing note on this.
Can I end on a happy note?
Okay, fine.
Good.
It's kind of off brand for me, but we.
I always end on a happy note. Anyone who's been to one of my civil society things. Okay, so we have done this over and over and over again. Like every new communications technology is not neutral. It's not neutral. And sometimes it takes us a while to figure out like what's going wrong with it. Like this happened with the printing press. It happened with the cheap printing press, also known as newspapers. It happened with radio, like Hitler rose to power largely on the back of radio, Rwanda, bad TV. It happens every single time. And the reason why it feels weird to us now is because this is our crisis. And this is like our burden to figure out what do we do. And it's really hard to go into white spaces where we don't know what to do next. But we've done it before. We've done it over and over again. Humans are very clever. We get out over our skis, but we will figure it out. And I believe in us. We just have to keep pushing for it.
That was way better than how I was going to end it.
Sorry.
Anyway, thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the IOP.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the stage David Axelrod and Jeffrey Goldberg.
That was nice. Yeah. Good touch.
Thank you. David.
Yes, Jeff. No, there's not going to be any singing involved, don't worry.
Unless you want singing, in which case, well, yeah, no, you don't. You really don't. Just wanted to say, on behalf of The Atlantic, a couple of things before I turn it over to David. First of all, thank you to David for calling me up. It seems like it just a couple of months ago. It was not long, and saying maybe we should do a conference on disinformation, and here we are. And I think it's been wildly successful, thanks to David first and foremost. By the usual measurements, I think this has been very successful. I think we're coming out knowing more than we knew coming in. I think we got some great speakers, sometimes agreeing with each other, sometimes not. I think one darkly humorous but inevitable measurement of our success is that our disinformation conference has been the subject of disinformation campaigns on social media already. So, yeah. Congratulate yourselves for that. We'll study that at next year's disinformation. Let me just say a couple of thank yous, and I just want to make sure I get everybody. One of the things that's been a real joy for us at The Atlantic has been working with the IOP team, getting to know the IOP team. I don't think this is an exaggeration to say that we do these things fairly often. We've never worked with a team this generous, calm, smart, clever, creative. Really, just a joy. Christine Hurley, first. Where's Christine? The maestro. Yeah. Tell her to come in the room. Yeah.
There she is.
There she is. David, yeah, that was just fantastic work. David whispered something to me about a raise. I don't know what it was. I don't know what he was referring to, but you might want to have at your 4 o'clock meeting.
By the Atlantic.
Yeah,
That was really generous.
Aaron Simpson, multi-talented. Aaron Simpson, Jennifer Steinauer, Joel Ebert, Karan Addo, and of course Zinat Rahman, who is the executive director of IOP. Where is she? Oh, hi. Right in front of me. I was looking in the
She
van.
moves around.
Really great getting to know all of you, Zinat and everybody, and just a tremendous experience putting this on with you. And we hope that we come out of here with, from our purposes, with new ideas for journalism, new ideas for coverage that I'm not really much into the solutions journalism model. I like the problem journalism model better, but I'm happy to publish pieces that actually provide some kind of a roadmap out. I guess I'm feeling optimistic based on that last that last moment. But we're delighted to get to know all of you. And David, again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. You know, there's this old proverb about I'd sooner light candles than curse the darkness. I think we just spent 3 days recognizing the darkness, but trying to light candles. And that last panel was the perfect way to end this discussion, because this is not a futile exercise. There are things that we can do. There is a better way. And our hope is that people will leave here energized to pursue those, as we will leave here energized to pursue them. We all have agency in this room, and we should use it, because this is a critical challenge for us, and we have to meet it. So we had this idea in the summer. It seemed ambitious, and this conference has outstripped all of my expectations, and it has for a whole variety of reasons. First of all, the partnership with the Atlantic, and I just want to commend Jeff, not just for what you and your team have done here, but for your commitment on the broader issue of democracy and the challenges that we face. You're lighting candles. And I really urge people to read the wonderful work the Atlantic continues to do. I want to say more about your team in a second. I want to thank the Benti Carl, I get I get nervous on this. The Benti Volio a family fund for, I got to ask you about the provenance of that. Why couldn't it have been the Smith family fund?
Bentivolio, what is the problem?
Bentivolio. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes. Please travel with me. The Joyce Foundation and the Crankstart Foundation, without whom we could not have put this conference on. And yes, I just have to add my thank. I could not be more proud of my team here at the IOP, and I appreciate the recognition that you've given them. I'm in awe of you guys, and I'm so grateful. And to the Atlantic team, to Emily Gottschalk Marconi, Ellen Cushing. Woo. Yes, give them a hand. Anna Bross and Adrienne LaFrance. These two teams have been speaking weekly for months and months and months to make this happen. And it's the combined resources that they brought to the conversation that has made this the conference that it is. The other thing and the last thing that I want to say is that all of you have made this the conference that it is. Those who've participated in these discussions on the stage and all the discussions that have gone on off the stage. And it's been inspiring to watch not just our students, but all the people who have come in from around the country who have a deep interest in this issue, attending these sessions, paying close attention, asking extraordinarily good questions. That also gives me hope. So thank you all for participating. I hope that this is just the first of many collaborations between the IOP and the Atlantic, and that together, with all our combined resources, everyone in this room, that the next time we get together, we'll celebrate real marked progress on this issue. Thank you. I guess we should say there are box lunches out there. So for those of you who want one more meal, it's waiting for you.